Hello, everybody. A very warm welcome to you and an excuse for a 5 minutes delay in these times with Deutsche Bahn. 5 minutes delay is like being on time, so sorry about that. Dear Minister Schulze, Excellencies, dear speakers, keynote speakers from the program on stage, dear participants from all over the world. I didn't ask where the camera is. We have also digital participants. So I just look there. Yeah, this is the camera. A very warm welcome to all of you here on site in Berlin, also in the digital live stream. We are delighted that you have accepted our invitation to this important conference today. It's the first high-profile event dedicated to addressing colonial continuities in German, coloniality in the professional term, in German development cooperation. And who is we? What is she talking about? First of all, of course, it is our host, the BMZ, the Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, and the other part is me. My name is Prasanna Ummen. I'm a moderator based in Cologne in Germany, working in Germany most of all and sometimes for the EU in Brussels, mainly in the field of transformation of institutions, development policy, culture and education, diversity, inclusion, and sometimes digitization. I have the honor to accompany you now for the next 3 hours as your moderator. And this is very special for me because the topic of today's conference is not only of my professional interest. Being born in Germany as a daughter of Indian immigrants who came over here 60 years ago, it also touches me personally, as I know coloniality affects not only professional but as well private lives. In this sense, I'm here to support in a neutral role of a moderator, but definitely with a very personal connection. Dear participants, from now on I will switch to German. We have agreed in the prep team that I will try a German-English combination. It means I will guide you through this event in German and on the panel later on, which is predominantly English-speaking, I will address direct questions in English and contextualize the conversation in German. It sounds a little bit experimental, I know, but serves the purpose that no important facts are lost in bilingual moderation. The topic is far too important. And also in view of the mix of actors from Germany and the global community. We wanted to ensure the translation in 4 languages today, German, English, French, and Spanish. And of course, there could be many more. And please excuse the fact that we are now only translating the languages of the colonial powers. This is due to the fact of diversity of languages in the most parts of the so-called Global South. So to start with, I would really like to thank our dedicated team of interpreters. You are an important pillar for us today. Just one applause for our interpreters. Thank you. So, und jetzt wechsle ich ins Deutsche.
And now let's switch into German. I'd like to give you all a very warm welcome here at the Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, and I'd also like to welcome everyone who's joining us online to this very first high-profile event organized by the BMZ that is dedicated to addressing coloniality in German development cooperation as well. This will be a focus of this afternoon. And please allow me to make a few introductory remarks on the goal and the purpose of the event and on the agenda. The motto and the title of today's event is Rethinking Development Policy, How to Confront Coloniality. The how-to is something that is to be taken literally. We mean what we say because the BMZ doesn't want to present any proposals as a top-down approach. That's really something that's a thing of the past. That's not what we want. That's not what the BMZ wants. We want to talk with you. We want to work with you. We want to think about ways to develop targeted measures to reduce instances of coloniality. And I'd like to invite you all very warmly to create a space of respect, of constructive dialogue, a space where we appreciate one another. And we also want to acknowledge the contribution of civil society, both those representatives from the diaspora and here from Germany. We really want to thank the members of civil society, because all the efforts, all the work done by a ministry are not possible without civil society. No agenda setting would be possible without civil society, which is why today we'll have two participatory formats that we want to use to talk about asymmetries of power based on an imbalance that is a structural imbalance between donors and recipients. We want to discuss this very openly. I will have some wonderful input today, and it's my privilege to have discussions beforehand with the speakers of an event, which is really a great honor. So we really have a great group of speakers. First of all, we'll hear a cultural contribution setting the tone for today's event, and then we'll have the first keynote speech delivered by by an ambassador, and then sorry, no, that was the other way around. First of all, the keynote delivered by the Federal Minister, Minister Schulze, and then a second keynote delivered by a high-ranking representative from international politics. And then we'll have a panel discussion with a lot of expertise, technical expertise, expertise on the subject that we're discussing, interdisciplinary expertise, and a lot of knowledge on the region that the different panelists come from. And that's all I'm going to tell you right now, because I want you to stay wide awake. And afterwards, we'll have what I call the verbal minutes, oral minutes. We'll have a brief summary of today's event. And afterwards, we'll invite you all very cordially to attend our exhibition and the reception. And I'll tell you more about it later. First of all, give me a warm welcome to the American-Nigerian author, Dipo Faloin, with a literary impulse from his success book, Africa is Not a Country. The book was published in 2022, so its title is Africa is Not a Country, Notes on a Bright Continent. It has been translated into many different languages. It breaks down prejudice and also refutes the images that are being reproduced again and again. It tells us different stories from 54 countries, those narratives that seem to have been erased in Western narratives. Dipo Faloin talks about the impacts of colonial perspectives as its impacts that are still predominant today. So a warm welcome to Dipo Faloin.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much for having me. So as was introduced, my name is Dipo Faloin, and I'm the author of the book Africa is Not a Country, which is available in German as well. And before I give a quick reading from the book, I thought let me just give a little bit of context to why I wrote this book. I wrote this book because there's a fundamental problem. When you ask most people around the world to close their eyes and picture Africa, they think of one of two things only: either poverty or safari, and very little else in between these two things. Which is strange for me because I come from a country, Nigeria, of 200 million people and over 250 different languages. And so I think about all the diversity that exists in that one country alone, all the many different cultures and experiences and histories within Nigeria. Then imagine expanding that across 54 countries and 1.4 billion people and over 2,000 languages. Which is why when I think about Africa, I think about diversity. And unfortunately, across history, not enough people have thought the same. And so I wanted to set out to not only challenge those stereotypes, but to break them down and to understand and explain to people where they came from in the first place. Which is why it's such an honor to be here in Berlin on this anniversary of the Berlin Conference, which really started these myths and stereotypes that we now understand about Africa. And so to understand where we are today, we need to understand where we came from. And that's where this book starts, at the Berlin Conference, at the beginning of the colonization of Africa and the start of taking away our personal identities and stopping us from telling our own stories. And so I start the book with this chapter and at the Berlin Conference, and I will read from the beginning of that chapter here today. The map was large and wrong, impressive and inaccurate. By height, it was 16 feet of topographic nonsense, outlined by men who had never set foot in 90% of the land it had claimed to portray. The drawing was largely based on reports of adventures around the region's coastline, where humans were weighed, shackled, and traded away into slavery. Stories of vast pools of water, tales of regions where the sun was hot but agreeable, and where local diseases were believed to be sufficiently mild that it was possible a white man would not die within 10 hours of his toes landing on hard soil. Many of these men, whom history requires we politely call explorers, did die quickly, because diseases are complex mutational organisms, the sun is rarely loyal to strangers, and some local rulers realized that maybe, just maybe, these white men in khaki did not have their community's best interests at heart. But the men who did manage to survive knew they were on to something special, and they were, because for centuries the native population had worked to make it so. Undeterred, they kept searching and exploring, unaided by the inconvenient trivialities of rules or a moral compass. However, these travelers soon realized that their discovery was not solely their own. They weren't concerned with the presence of the actual local people, the mothers, the fathers, the children, the doctors, the teachers, and the poets, who lived on the lands they were trudging through for the very first time. That didn't seem to bother them at all. What struck fear into them was that rival European nations were also sniffing around, looking to carve out sizable chunks of empire for themselves. The explorers, worried that everything would soon be claimed, rivals from all corners of Europe, names that are still taught today in schools, started a race, later coined the scramble for Africa, to own as much of somebody else's continent as they could. This scramble was competitive, involving multiple heavyweight nations of the age of empire building. With that came the threat of a damaging international conflict, not with local communities across the African continent, with their inconvenient hopes and dreams and physical bodies, but among the Western nations who wanted a piece of the pie. In an attempt to avoid all-out war over who got to wage war in Africa, the mighty colonialists decided to meet and hash it all out, to come to a communal understanding as to how they could perfectly calculate their siege. And so the white men in khaki gathered at the Berlin Conference on the snowy afternoon of the 15th of November, 1884, where they sat under a large map. The drawing loomed large over a horseshoe-shaped table at 77 Wilhelmstrasse, the official residence of the German Chancellor, Otto von Bismarck. The men who had gathered there had no real idea of what they were looking at. They had no concrete understanding of the intricacies of the map's interior. Their knowledge was constricted by their previously single interest in shipping off slaves from the coast. Looking now to the future, it was the promise of Africa's vast natural resources that made confiscating its fate such a tempting prospect. The men in the room represented the interests of 14 nations: Britain, France, Portugal, the Netherlands, Denmark, Spain, Italy, Belgium, Austria-Hungary, Russia, Sweden, Norway, the Ottoman Empire, the United States, and Germany. They were there at Bismarck's invitation. The Chancellor worried that the scramble for the continent was leaving Germany behind. He needed to slow things down and ensure that his country had a fair grab at the loot. One thing almost all agreed on was that it was their natural right to explore the region and take whatever they wanted. Or, as the prominent academic John Westlake elegantly said at the time, begin quote, "The inflow of the white race cannot be stopped where there is land to cultivate, ore to be mined, commerce to be developed, sport to enjoy, curiosity to be satisfied." End quote. 80% of Africa was still free when Bismarck rode to stand in front of that map at around 2 p.m. on the first day of the conference. Within 30 years of that moment, 90% of Africa would be controlled by Europe. Until then, the continent had been made up of vast ancient kingdoms, smaller nomadic communities, and everything in between. The European view had been that Africa's interior was largely to be avoided. The region was a place you stopped in briefly to pick up strong black men and transport them to slave plantations in exchange for sugar or whatever else you could weigh a person's life against. Bismarck began his welcome speech by reminding everyone that they were all very good people. He reinforced the notion that it was the uncivilized Africans and their uncivilized land that would benefit most from being served the 3 C's that Livingstone had previously subscribed and the conference aimed to bring: commerce, Christianity, and civilization. By opening up the vast continent to colonization, they claimed, they would help these uncivilized natives become wiser and better. Nobody disagreed. Now that was a lot to achieve, especially considering not a single person from the African continent was invited to take part at the Berlin Conference. If African representatives had been invited, perhaps they would have objected, or at the very least pointed out that drawing random straight lines on an inaccurate map might lead to some long-term internal frictions that would inevitably take generations and generations and generations to untangle from their cursed roots. Perhaps African representatives would have chosen to identify on the map which communities spoke which languages and worshipped which gods. Some thought might have gone into how dangerous it could be to run a border through proud ancient kingdoms and cultures, and how forcing disparate ethnic groups to live under a single banner might make governing these wholly invented nations somewhat complicated. The conference finally finished on the 26th of February, 1885. Bound by their commitment to avoid any talk of sovereignty, the group didn't draw physical borders on the giant map and hound out portions of destiny right there and then. But what they did do instead was just as impactful. They devised the General Act of the Berlin Conference, a document that codified the end of Africa's right to self-determination and accelerated the rush to gorge the continent until it was picked clean. The document may not have been the starter gun for the scramble, but it would spark the all-out mission of occupation. That Africa's fate should not be left to Africans has been the West's go-to strategy in the region for almost every one of the 140 years since then. It is how modern treaties are organized and charitable donations are shared. It's the attitude on display when governments, themselves struggling with democracy, release patronizing statements about how African countries should respect democracy. This mindset simplified the complex ecosystems of a landmass that covered more than 11 million square miles and was home to hundreds of millions of people as blank spaces on an atlas that could be claimed by turning up and declaring authority over the bodies and traditions of everyone who had existed there for generations. But Africa is more. It's always been more. The Berlin Conference did not see this because they allowed a large, inaccurate map to hover over every decision they made. They honed in on what Africa could be for them. And what it could be for Europe turned out to be a lot. For Africa, it turned out to be everything. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Vielen herzlichen Dank, Dipu Faluin, für.
Thank you so very much, Dipu Faluin, for this very impressive input. We are now continuing immediately. I think we have been tuned in very well into the topic. We're continuing with our host, the Federal Minister for Economic Cooperation and Development. Please welcome Minister Svenja Schulze.
Und wir haben uns nicht abgesprochen mit der Klamotten.
And we did not pre-arrange our matching colors here. Excellencies, members of Parliament, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests.
Der Zeitpunkt unserer heutigen Veranstaltung.
It is not by accident that today's event is held on this particular day, as
Dank für diese
People Faluin just pointed out to us very clearly. Thank you again for these impressive words. I think most in this room know your book, but hearing it from you was really very impressive. Thank you so much.
deutsche Ministerin ein
Ladies and gentlemen, personally, and also in my capacity as German minister, it is important to me to commemorate the Berlin Conference of 1884 and recognize the consequences of it, which can still be felt today. By the way, the document is here today. You can take a look at it outside. The representatives of the colonial powers of the time, exclusively men, met just about 700 meters from here at the office of German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck at Wilhelmstrasse. He had invited them to the conference in Berlin, as we just heard. No representatives from Africa had been invited. This conference was an abominable key moment in colonialism. It laid down the rules for the further partition of the African continent among the colonial powers. Over the following 20 years, they incorporated 80% of the African continent in colonial empires and protectorates. The colonial rulers divided cultural, political, and economic communities and used armed violence to assert their claim to colonial rule. Exploitation and oppression were part of everyday life. Local people, authorities, and cultures in Africa were something that the colonial rulers were completely indifferent to. The 1884 conference was and remains an expression of a sense of superiority, which, unfortunately, we can still encounter even today, 140 years later. 5 centuries of European colonialization left a deep mark on other continents too. The defining elements of those regions and continents before the arrival of colonialism, cultures, government systems, educational institutions, structures of commerce, all this was destroyed by colonization and erased from the records of history, not only in Africa. That is why today's event is about cooperation with all regions of the world. So far, Germany has not dealt appropriately with its own responsibility, but it has made a start. The German government laid down this task in the coalition agreement for the current term of government. Last year, Federal President Frank-Walter Steinmeier paid a much-noted visit to Tanzania and asked for forgiveness for German colonial crimes there, and my predecessor, Development Minister Heidemar Richard Zoll, came to Namibia in 2004 and asked for forgiveness for the atrocities committed by the German colonial power. It is time that, as a society too, we face up to this past and for our school books to finally address this blind spot in our history. It is time for us to become aware of what this means for the people of the colonized countries to this day and what conclusions we should draw from that in Germany. Thanks to an active civil society and diaspora groups, this debate is picking up speed. Awareness is rising that our ways of thinking and perception are still shaped by colonial thought patterns, and also accordingly that it's necessary to change this unconscious bias and these unconscious thinking patterns. It is not only our perceptions and thought patterns that are rooted in European colonialism. This also goes for many inequalities and power divides that are visible in today's world. In the global economy, many countries, especially in Africa, still play primarily the role of providers of raw materials. 2/3 of all exports from Africa are metal, minerals, oil, gas, and unprocessed agricultural goods. Value addition, just like in colonial times, is happening elsewhere. 70% of all cocoa, for instance, comes from Africa, but only 1% of all chocolate. Europe's chocolate producers and coffee roasters make many times more money than those who plant the cocoa and coffee. Farmers are barely able to make a living and often work under inhuman conditions. And it's no different for cotton or cashews or for extractive resources. Less local value addition means a lack of resources for education, infrastructure, or healthcare. This means that unequal opportunities are perpetuated for generations, as are dependencies. The countries in the Global South, governments, business people, civil societies in the Global South, they often start from a worse basis than others. A basis that was laid, not least, through colonial rule and its consequences. These continuing consequences can be summarized under coloniality. These consequences can also be found in development cooperation, the very policy field that is intended to reduce global inequality and improve equality of opportunity. Colonial ways of thinking have played a role in forming the thought patterns, structures, and instruments of development cooperation, often without us even realizing that this is so. Aren't many people in Germany accepting it as a matter of course that our institutions, our technologies, our way of life are superior to those of others? That other countries have deficits and we in Germany have strategies against them? That we have the expertise, not the experts from the Global South? How conscious are we of the fact that our understanding of development is primarily oriented to a Western-defined idea of growth and advancement? In other words, that is based on standards which were defined primarily by former colonial powers. In order to launch a systematic reflection on these and other questions, we launched a process at the Development Ministry last year. It is about a self-critical, honest view at the role of the Development Ministry. We are asking ourselves how partnership-based cooperation can be shaped when partners start from an unequal basis, and what standard working practices may be problematic because they reinforce asymmetries rather than reducing them, or create dependencies rather than overcoming them. Let me give you 3 specific examples of how this process is already making a difference in the work of the ministry. First, the BMZ is strengthening partner orientation. Many of you know that the key format in which we organize our international cooperation is government negotiations. Ministries of our partner countries come together with the German Development Ministry regularly to agree on the volume and kind of cooperation program they will have. In other words, Germany commits funding for jointly agreed priorities and actions. In view of the fact that there is an asymmetry of power if one side provides funding to the other, it is clear that we need to change the practice of our negotiations in order to achieve a more balanced approach. There must be an early exchange on the negotiating positions and more mutual interaction and engagement in the planning processes, because only if the interests of both sides are clearly identified at an early point will it be possible to make cooperation truly partnership-based. Partner orientation also means not just relying on experts from the global north, but also making bigger use of the important local knowledge that is available, because the criticism is true. Local knowledge still is not being valued appropriately in academia. The local perspective thus often lacks in scientific publications and recommendations, meaning that too little of that perspective is incorporated in the planning and implementation of development policy. As a ministry, we will make stronger use of local expertise at all levels. Here's my second example. The BMZ is increasing its efforts to reduce asymmetries of power in the international system. For instance, regarding the voting rights of countries of the Global South in international financial institutions, or in the new Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage. For that fund, the BMZ succeeded with its efforts of advocacy for giving a majority to countries of the Global South. And in October, we had a discussion with representatives of Sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East and North Africa and Latin America on how to make the governance of the World Bank more equitable. It will be vital to strengthen the say and influence of borrowing countries in World Bank governance and upholding attractive lending conditions for precisely these countries. That's what I'm working for as World Bank governor. Thirdly, we're starting in our own institution, among our own staff, because they play the vital role when it comes to changing colonial patterns of thought and action at the ministry and firmly establishing truly partnership-based cooperation, because it is they, the staff, who have the main role in shaping Germany's development policy in this exchange with partners and stakeholders. That is why we launched in-house training on unconscious bias and diversity. This is an area where we all can and must constantly learn. We will further deepen these first steps. Confronting coloniality is also becoming part of the onboarding exercises for new staff members and training for people in leadership positions and in the preparations that people go through who go to work at one of the embassies of Germany in our partner countries. So the BMZ has embarked on this journey. We are getting support from a team of external advisors who are internationally linked experts from academia, civil society, and organizational development. And they are here with us today. A warm welcome to you. This external perspective, which is sometimes challenging for the way that the ministry views itself, is absolutely vital in order to recognize in which areas action is needed most and how to address them. We seek to engage in dialogue with our partners, with you, to make that happen. I regard the BMZ as a learning institution which has a close exchange with stakeholders from politics, the private sector, academia and civil society, and wants to have such a close exchange. And it is clear that dialogue with each partner, with each country, will be different, which is a good thing. And of course, in all this, our government-owned organizations, GIZ and KfW, are closely involved because it is they that implement the specific projects together with our partners. Ladies and gentlemen, as Germans, as Europeans, we have the task to own up to the mistakes of the past. There can be no question about that. At the same time, all actors should abandon the old roles that make a constructive dialogue more difficult, be it a tendency to hand out advice out of a sense of guilt or superiority, or the tendency to blame colonial rule for all undesirable developments. What is needed is an open, frank dialogue on all sides and the honest definition of interests in the sense of a partnership that benefits both sides. I am confident because this dialogue is underway, and how we can pursue it further is something that we will be discussing this afternoon. One thing is certain: confronting coloniality requires great perseverance. And the advisory team has also told us that the BMZ should make this effort to confront coloniality part of its DNA as an institution and firmly establish it, which also means that it's no good to just think in terms of term of government. And the current term of government will be even shorter than we thought. Germany is about to have new elections on February 23rd, which means that today's event is all the more important. It is a starting point, and it is a handover of a task to all those involved to further advance this important process, based on the understanding that only more dialogue will facilitate more transparency, more mutual understanding, and thus trust. Some of you have been engaged in the debate on confronting coloniality for a much longer time than the BMZ, and you may say, all of this is not enough. I would like to tell you that we take this criticism seriously and think about it. In the talks which I have with many different people, especially in our partner countries, I can see that they often have very clear ideas of what they expect from cooperation. Let us enter the dialogue with this type of clarity and openness in order to reduce coloniality and design an international cooperation which is based on mutual obligations and shared interests. A type of cooperation which strengthens both partners. Ladies and gentlemen, you can see that there is a lot to be done. And I look forward to the discussion with you and your contributions. Thank you very much.
Frau Bundesministerin,
Minister, thank you very much for your very open and committed presentation, and we will respond to it right away. I promised you that we have 2 participatory formats, and we're starting right away with the first one. We're having a Mentimeter survey. Anybody doesn't know that? Well, during COVID, we had a lot of time to practice it. That's good. This is also open to the digital audience. You can respond to what you have just heard. That is what we mean when we say we're serious about this. After the input you heard in terms of the literary input and the keynote of the minister, what is on your mind? And we developed 3 questions. So could you go to menti.com?
Geben Sie dort folgende Antwort zu der
And the first question, you can send answers. What is needed to build more equitable international cooperation? The Mentimeter is in English, so what does it take to create more equity in cooperation? So the tag cloud, the word cloud is now emerging. I'm moving over a little bit so you can see it well. The first answers keep arriving. There's quite a variety here. You are entering this on your smartphones. Is a lot coming? Oh yeah. Trust, respect, honesty, dialogue, listening. Listening is important, and we'll be listening a lot today. Transparency, solidarity, reparations. Solidarity, respect, honesty, dialogue, transparency, love. I just saw that. There's quite a mix here. Does it keep changing? Courage, very important. Communication, also very important. If we look at what we just heard from the minister on the process. Communication, how do we communicate with each other? Empathy. The keywords aren't changing so much. Courage has been added. Reparations, empathy, justice.
Humility.
And humility. Trust, honesty, respect keeps staying at the center. And looking at the panelists here, this is certainly something that we can talk about, how to add action to trust, honesty, dialogue, and respect. Let's move on to the second question. This is about where is the problem? Where are the obstacles? What challenges hinder equitable partnerships in international cooperation?
Seien Sie ehrlich.
Be honest. Tell us what should be put on the agenda. Capitalism, racism, ignorance. I saw ego. I think that's also an important aspect. Eurocentrism. Double standards. Money, selfishness, capitalism, racism, ignorance, corruption. These are the biggest words in the middle. capitalism, racism, ignorance, egoism, stereotypes. This too is something that we will be discussing today. Greed. And I just saw power imbalance. We already heard about that too. Lack of knowledge. That's smaller, but that's also an important building block in this entire setup. We will be discussing this on the panel. Arrogance.
Aber die drei zentralen oder vier zentralen Punkte, ignorance, corruption,
So ignorance, corruption, racism, capitalism,
stereotypes, double standards.
egotism, double standards are things that I would highlight. Which takes us to the third question.
Das Hausaufgabenbuch für das BMZ.
This is about homework for the BMZ. What should the ministry focus on to address colonialism in development cooperation? So, time for you to give us a to-do list or some homework.
Jetzt warte ich noch einen kleinen Moment.
I'm waiting just a little bit.
So, Dialogue Diversity.
Dialogue, diversity, tax billionaires. Are these the answers to the third question? Interesting.
Muss ich einmal fragen? Okay. Tax billionaires, racism, listening,
Racism, listening, dialogue, civil society. You can be more honest or more specific, to put it that way. I think you're sincere and honest, but more specific. Local knowledge, reparations, money, diversity. Maybe we should look at that more closely.
local knowledge, partnership,
Partnership, openness,
justice again.
justice.
Worauf sollen wir uns fokussieren? Ja,
What should we focus on? So we should focus on diversity.
Insight gemeint. Na, also die
I suppose that also refers to the internal workings of the ministry, not just an external perspective. Money, listening. So we should focus on listening. I'm saying we, but I mean the BMZ.
wir sollen uns auf die Tax
We should focus on taxing billionaires. We should focus on human rights,
nach wie vor. Das ist
communication. This keeps coming back. Inclusion, partners in the lead. That's an important point too.
auch Ownership abgeben.
Hand over ownership, equality.
Ich glaube, wir haben
Well, I think we've covered the main points. Did I forget anything? Does anybody want to holler a word that I overlooked?
aber auf jeden Fall später sich noch beteiligen.
Nobody's hollering, but you're welcome to participate later on. Solidarity and accountability, that too is something we should focus on. Thank you so very much for taking part, and applause for all of you.
So, jetzt haben wir schon viel sozusagen.
This has brought us forward in many ways in terms of words we can take to our panel, but before that, I'm delighted that Dr. Martin Kimani has joined us. Ambassador Martin Kimani has a PhD in security policy from King's College in London. From 2021 to 2024, he was permanent representative and ambassador of Kenya to the United Nations. He is now the executive director of the Center on International Cooperation, CIC, at New York University. His keynote today is entitled Coloniality in International Cooperation and the Way Forward. So the stage is yours, Ambassador Kimani.
You're welcome.
Good afternoon. Honorable Minister, State Minister, I think the Director General, distinguished guests and colleagues and friends, it's a really great privilege to join you today in addressing a topic as complex and urgent as coloniality in international cooperation. I really commend BMZ and the Honorable Minister Svenja Schulze for your willingness to engage in a conversation that demands honesty, courage, and intellectual rigor. Such dialogues are quite rare in their challenging the systems and practices so many of us have grown comfortable with. Yet they are indispensable if we're to forge a path towards genuine partnership rooted in recognition of the distressed neighbor's humanity and its connection to ours. What we're doing here together is an essential step toward reshaping the systems of international cooperation that define our collective future. It is a pleasure to be in Berlin, despite it being gray and rainy. It's a city I so admired that as a doctoral student, I once even tried to identify a real estate agent to find me an apartment in what was then a relatively affordable Mitte, which is no longer affordable, I'm told. My admiration came from witnessing this city's courage in publicly and prominently examining its history. Unlike the pomp and glorification of colonial conquest and adventures that is so prominent when you visit cities like London or Paris, Berlin stands apart. Here there is an acknowledgement, a recognition that the pursuit of glory and dominance extracts an unbearable cost in the suffering and oppression of those on the other side of the bullet and the bayonet. The shadow of the Berlin Conference, not to mention the signed document just outside, a conference that kicked off just over 140 years ago, looms heavily over us all. That meeting was far removed from the lives it would devastate, divided a continent into territories to be governed, extracted from, and controlled. Its legality, its appeal to peace and reason, to free trade and progress, when in reality it was the start of violent dispossession, is precisely why its legacy endures so powerfully to this day. It was multilateralism in action, crafting and embedding structures that would later shape the League of Nations and ultimately the United Nations. This legacy, profoundly exclusionary in its denial of African representation and in its design to formalize domination rather than equality, endures to this day. The League of Nations mandates were a direct extension of Berlin's colonial logic, categorizing territories based on their supposed readiness for self-rule and placing them under the tutelage in quotes, of advanced nations. This system institutionalized the belief that non-European populations were incapable of self-governance, reinforcing a paternalistic framework that prioritized control and resource extraction over self-determination. Between these two milestones, the concept of development evolved as a calculated tool. After Berlin, it was tied to extraction, like I have said, and it was cloaked in rhetoric about bringing order and progress to Africa through actually its exploitation. This ideology hardened under the League of Nations mandates, where development became a justification for governance systems designed to marginalize local agency, weaponize the politics of the colonized against their own aspirations for freedom, and entrench exploitative tax and trade regimes. To understand the persistence of coloniality to this day, we need to appreciate its intellectual origins. Colonialism was more than geopolitical maneuvering. It was a product of the pseudoscientific ideas that dominated European thought at the time. The racial science and eugenics movements sought to establish hierarchies among human populations, using deeply flawed methodologies to legitimize colonial expansion. Figures like Eugene Fischer, from right here in Berlin, measured skulls, cataloged physical features, measured lengths of fingers, and drew arbitrary conclusions about the supposed superiority of certain races. One day in a different forum, I'll tell you more about my archival relationship with Eugene Fischer, whose name rings very loudly in history. African nations and peoples, and much of what we call the Global South today, were not regarded as holding rich histories and governance systems of their own, but as blank slates, a resource-rich expanse free of politics and civilization awaiting European intervention. This racialized worldview justified the dispossession of African peoples and the imposition of foreign governance structures, framing these actions as a benevolent, civilizing mission. The violence that underpinned colonial rule was obscured by these paternalistic narratives that continue to echo in so much contemporary development discourse. The interconnection between colonial and metropolitan racial ideologies highlights the pervasive nature of coloniality. The same intellectual currents that informed the governance of colonized territories shaped policies in Europe, from the Nuremberg laws to the apartheid systems that were then transported to Southern Africa. This grim continuity underscores the need to confront coloniality as a global challenge, one that transcends geographic and historical boundaries. As Faulkner wrote, the past is never dead. It's not even past. Coloniality is not a relic of history. It is an active logic that dictates how nations engage, how development is conceived, and why inequity continues to define our world today. For a long time, I have been deeply interested in how colonialism, racial segregation, and white supremacy, systems of power that are embedded in our social relations, transform everyone they touch. Victims, perpetrators, and even bystanders are marked in ways that make these systems so enduring and so difficult to uproot. Sustainability in development is often reduced to environmental balance or economic viability, but we must broaden it. True sustainability demands healing the psychological and relational damage these systems have wrought. Frantz Fanon argued that colonialism dehumanizes the colonized, embedding in them self-doubt, dependency, and internalized oppression, while also corrupting the colonizer with illusions of superiority and dominance. And he saw this in a psychological, psychiatric manner. James Baldwin took it further, revealing how white supremacy traps the oppressor in moral paralysis, cutting them off from their own humanity. These are not just abstract theories. They are living realities that shape the field of development today and the people touched by it, whether as practitioners or beneficiaries. There is no small number of aid givers who often mirror colonial hierarchies while recipients are left navigating the scars of dependency and diminished agency. It resides in the unspoken assumption that the global North holds the solutions while the South remains a passive recipient of knowledge, capital, and expertise. This is why development often reinforces dependency instead of fostering self-reliance. Aid flows conditioned on compliance with foreign priorities, technical assistance framed as expertise despite its detachment from local realities, and policies shaped by foreign experts. All these are echoes of a colonial logic that values control over collaboration. In Africa, these damaging dynamics are compounded by the legacy of colonial governance structures. Most African states were never designed to serve their populations. They were built with no regard for the well-being of those that they governed or ruled. Independence may have brought sovereignty, but it did not erase the foundational weaknesses of these institutions. The challenges we see today, weak state capacity, fragile legitimacy, and economic vulnerability, are not merely the results of mismanagement by African leaders. They are also the results of them governing states that are direct descendants of colonial structures. Perhaps it was the dangers of the Cold War or the culture and psychology of the elites who inherited the reins of power, but very few of them succeeded in transforming the state into something fundamentally new, something fit for purpose. Many, in fact, sought to benefit from the same colonial logic that had subjugated their people. Today, the African state is beset by fiscal and environmental stresses and is still grappling with the fragility of the social contract it holds with its citizens. This brings us to a critical question. Can development truly escape the gravity of its history? Can it be rehabilitated into a practice of equity and healing instead of one that reinforces hierarchies, unjust and crushing hierarchies? The answer does not lie in small adjustments, but in a willingness to confront this history and reimagine the systems and relationships that sustain it. So, colleagues, I think you will agree that I have sufficiently admired the problem at hand. So you may now be wondering what I believe the solution to be after casting aspersions all over the place. Well, my answer is twofold. First, we must strive to do what we already do better, pursuing reforms that I am certain many of you have already begun, as evidenced by the thoughtful invitation for me to deliver this address. Second, we must revolutionize international cooperation, transforming it into a framework capable of achieving deep strategic aims while remaining firmly rooted in mutual respect and win-win outcomes. Let me come to Germany's role. For the second part of that strategy, going beyond just doing better at what we do to undertaking fundamental transformation, we can begin casting international cooperation as a response to Germany's role in a changing world. I am suggesting that Germany take on the burden of addressing coloniality in international cooperation as both a moral obligation and a strategic necessity. As you all know, we're living through an era of profound geopolitical shifts. Multipolarity is no longer an emerging trend. It defines our reality today. In this volatile and dangerous environment, Europe's ability to assert its autonomy and influence amid the pressures of American and Chinese power is precarious. Europe needs an ace in the hole. Germany, as Europe's wealthiest nation, faces mounting challenges to its export-driven economy, shifting global supply chains, shrinking markets, and the looming impact of declining fertility on labor force participation. Germany needs a new growth model. Africa, with its youthful population, rapid urbanization, and vast economic potential, offers a pathway to mutual renewal and growth, not just for Germany, but for Europe as a whole. But this pathway cannot follow the same old patterns. It must break free from the present limited stakes of development as currently practiced and the confines of coloniality, and reach instead for genuine partnership. This is not about virtue, though there will be plenty of virtue to win. It is about a bold, visionary strategy for Germany to secure economic resilience and geopolitical relevance in a rapidly shifting global order. Africans will applaud such a move because they are no longer content to serve as a resource frontier or as passive recipients of aid. Nor are they able to understand a Germany whose development priorities are not clear and attached to Germany's key interests. Such a strategy, of course, cannot be pursued with all countries that receive German assistance. For the majority, the first option may have to apply, reforms to the existing model to make it better. The big bets should be on a small number of promising countries. Imagine identifying 2 or 3 and going all out by leveraging German capital and technology to partner to unlock transformative growth. Nigeria, South Africa, Kenya, these are examples that are all benefiting to some extent from the present development focus, but it is still hugely insufficient as a leading way of engaging them. Their needs are for at-scale investment. If Germany genuinely commits to such a strategy, it would be a game changer. It would also be robust enough to be embraced by a spectrum of domestic political parties, some of whom are rightly or wrongly very skeptical of traditional approaches to aid. Done well, such a strategy would not need to be labeled as decolonization, but framed in terms of Germany's national interest. Now, of course, this does not only depend on German leadership. The vision that I'm urging on our leaders here, and some of them are here, such as Minister Schulze, need to be matched by equally visionary leadership from the African side and from the global south. Otherwise, the two can never meet. I'll cover a few more suggestions before I leave the stage. In the changes that need to be made to international cooperation, two critical insights or principles in addressing coloniality should be constantly at hand. For too long, development and modernization have been conflated with westernization. The implicit message has been that success requires replicating European models of governance, economics, and society. Nguyen Ang's, she's a political economist at Johns Hopkins, has a principle, a very simple principle of use what you have, which offers a sharp challenge to the legacy of coloniality in development. It rejects the imposition of external models that fail to fit local realities, urging instead the strengthening of existing institutions, however flawed, through use and adaptation. This stands in stark contrast to the logic of the Berlin Conference and the mandate system, which undermined local governance structures and entrenched dependency by imposing foreign frameworks. Today, development still largely mirrors these patterns, minus the violence, favoring imported solutions over locally grounded strategies. Ang's approach demands a shift, recognizing and leveraging the strengths within existing systems to drive progress from within. In other words, we don't have to become like Denmark to become as rich as Denmark. Right? This is moving from paternalistic aid to real partnerships that invest in local capacity and leadership. By adopting this perspective, development can finally break free from the logics of the past and become a force for sustainable, equitable growth. I think if you look at the work of Ang, she makes a convincing argument that this has been China's successful approach, and it echoes Germany's own development history as well. Your post-war reconstruction succeeded because you tailored your strategies to your unique context. You leveraged your strengths and addressed your specific challenges. Similarly, Africa's development cannot be about becoming like Germany or Denmark. It must be about modernization rooted in African realities, drawing on the strengths of our local institutions and adapting global best practices to local needs. This requires a shift in mindset. But what does success look like? How will the world look if you succeed in addressing coloniality? We have to imagine success to begin to approach it. It's not enough to critique the present, we must articulate a vision for ourselves in the future. Success, to me, would mean the realization of the African Union's Agenda 2063, its blueprint for integration, prosperity, and peace. It would mean economies that are industrialized and resilient, capable of creating jobs and generating wealth for their citizens. It would mean governance systems that are inclusive, accountable, and trusted by the people they serve. That success cannot be built on the traditional model of cooperation. That is why I recommend you focus on 2 or 3 African countries, helping their efforts to become examples of transformed economies and states. The power of a good example cannot be overstated. By concentrating its capital, technology, and expertise in nations like Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa, or others, Germany can demonstrate what decolonized cooperation looks like and gain enormous soft power from it. It would inspire others, shift regional dynamics, and prove that genuine partnership delivers shared growth and resilience, which we all need. But success is not just about outcomes, it is also about process. A decolonized development paradigm would empower African states to set their own priorities, design their own policies, and implement their own solutions. It would recognize that expertise exists everywhere, not just in the global north. It would replace the hierarchical relationships of the past with genuine partnerships based on mutual respect. At the heart of this challenge lies the question of state competence. And many, many countries are recipients of German international cooperation, have weak and sometimes even failing states. The governance structures, as I said, that were imposed by colonial powers were designed for extraction and control, not for inclusivity or effectiveness. And today's post-independent states inherited these structures, and largely speaking, many of the political classes in those states are not willing to question the very basis of the state that they dominate and utilize. That is why this speech actually needs to be mirrored, not just to this audience, but to an audience of African political leaders as well. Because if they don't get it, there shall be no decoloniality in international cooperation. And what's going to happen if we do not decolonize these systems is that in many countries in Africa, the state shall come under such enormous stress that there shall be instances of state collapse and other extensive political instability. For the last dozen years or so, from the Tahrir Square to the wave of coups across the Sahel belt, to the revolution in Sudan, and even to the popular uprisings in different parts of the continent from Kenya to Mozambique, it is very clear that young people in Africa will not stand to be governed by post-colonial states that have embraced the logic of coloniality and are unable to deliver the public goods that young people demand. So we have to move forward together. I will close by saying coloniality in international cooperation is a challenge that belongs to all of us. As I've said, even the psychological underpinnings of these colonial continuities belong not just to European ex-colonial powers, but to the ex-colonies themselves. We have to do a mutual work of psychological recovery together because we are all damaged deeply by our relations with one another and how we have built an entire practice of development with so much of that damage not addressed yet. So the most natural demand after this speech is, of course, for me to move to specifics, reform sectors, and investments that align with Germany's strengths and actionable proposals for building new partnerships and executing them effectively. I would be more than honored to continue this conversation, to accompany you in this tremendous moment of possibility for Germany, to undertake the pragmatic work of escaping coloniality. And I will remain available, enthusiastically so, and happy and open to helping your focused research agenda in support of such a transformative and worthwhile endeavor. I want to just say in closing that to have this conference, to live stream it, I didn't know, Minister, that you were going to live stream it, is really, to me, an indication of intellectual honesty and integrity. There's so much that has happened that is so negative. There's so much hurt and violence and injustice that has happened. It has happened. But the choice to sit and look at it and address it and begin to ask how can the future be different, this is a fundamentally inspiring choice. And I'm very, very grateful and respectful of BMZ for having this kind of vision. And I really hope that it comes to be reflected in Germany's leadership in the area of freeing us all from the damage, the lasting damage, the continuing damage of colonial forms of power relations. Thank you.
You take a seat. Take a seat, please. Yes. Thank you very much, Ambassador Kimani. We will give you the chance to get even more specific to especially to the last point. But I first start to introduce the other panelists. Thank you very much. Liebe TeilnehmerInnen, wir werden im Anschluss an dieses Panel, was ich jetzt gleich einleite, ja das
Participants, after the following panel discussion, we will have the second participatory format, a round of Q&A with you. So please write down any questions that you may have now. So smartphones are okay if they're muted. So please write down any questions that you may have after the keynote speeches and also the panel discussion. So we now have a panel discussion that will be dedicated to the question that we just heard. We want to become more specific. We want to use the expertise of various panelists to talk about the question of how to shape a just development cooperation model for the future, to go beyond with the traditional donor-recipient relationship, to break up this concept also in the long run. And we want to look at the status quo, first of all. What is the current situation? We've heard quite a lot about the current situation already, but we want to shed light on this question from different perspectives. We really want to talk about very specific, tangible measures. What needs to be on the to-do list? And of course, it's always good to look at specific examples. We've already heard some examples in the speeches, but as I said, for motivation and for actually doing things in practice, it's really important to have best practices, good examples that can guide your work. So I'm very pleased to introduce the panelists that have come together to share their expertise with us.
So she is a PhD. Just one applause, first of all. You come here. Oh, here, come here. It's easier, yeah. So I just introduced you. She is a PhD student at the HU Berlin and is doing her doctorate in collaboration with the Leibniz Center for Agricultural Landscape Research, abbreviation SALF for everybody. And World Fish Cambodia, an initiative on collective action in food systems, which is very interesting, specifically on the topic of fish farming and socio-ecological challenges in South Bolivia, which is her home country, and central Cambodia. Carla Baldivieso works also on the coloniality of knowledge. This year, on the occasion of the Tropentag at the HU Berlin, she co-organized a workshop on coloniality. Thank you very much that you're here. Again, now. And now I welcome also to the stage Lassina Kone. Please give him one applause, share one applause with us. After many years in tech, he took up the role as digital transformation advisor to the Prime Minister of Côte d'Ivoire. Then, since 2019, he has been the CEO and General Director of Smart Africa, an international partnership with over 30 member states for Africa's digital development agenda. 40 countries now. Yeah, we talked about now 40. Okay. Smart Africa supports governments, companies, and startups, and the aim of this alliance is to accelerate economic development through digital communication technologies. Welcome again. Second applause, please. And next, I would like to welcome Dylan Matthews. Please, one applause for Dylan Matthews. He has worked for peace-building, development, and humanitarian organizations for 20 years. And while working for the peace-building think tank, Oxford Research Group, he authored War Prevention Works, which profiled the role of non-state actors in conflict prevention and resolution. This publication helped launch Peace District in 2004, the British-American NGO for which Dylan Matthews has been working as the CEO for the last 10 years, and he also he's also the chair of Civicus, the world's largest civil society network. 1 second applause also for Dylan Matthews. Und dann begrüße ich als Repräsentantin des BMZ hier in der Runde ganz
And I'd like to welcome the Parliamentary State Secretary, Dr. Bärbel Kofler, as a representative of the BMZ here on stage. A big round of applause for you as well. Barb Kofler studied IT and linguistics. She's been a member of the German Bundestag for 20 years, so she's a very experienced member of the German Bundestag. Between 2016 and 2021, she was the German government commissioner for human rights policy and humanitarian assistance, and since 2021, she's been parliamentary state secretary at the BMZ. So we're very pleased to have you with us today, and we're very happy that you'll be sharing with us the perspective of the ministry and also be sitting here in a listening mode, so to speak. So that's also what we saw in the tag cloud of the Mentimeter. So listening is so important. That's why I will be addressing Ms. Kofler at the very end and ask my questions after all the others have been asked my questions. So we're very pleased to have this setup, and let us start straight away with the first aspect. We would like to discuss the status quo, the current situation, and then talk about good practices and suitable measures. So an anti-racist and decolonizing cooperation, what are its characteristics, and how can it be made more equitable despite different preconditions or asymmetries? And I'd like to start with you, Dr. Kamani, to build on your keynote again.
Headquarters in February 2022, you said our borders were drawn in the distant colonial metropoles with no regard for the ancient nations that they cleaved apart. Today, across the border of every single African country live our countrymen with whom we share deep historical, cultural, and linguistic bonds. And now, when we remember your last point in your keynote, what do these countries need in terms of reducing the impact of colonial destruction of identities, also regarding internalized colonial thinking and methods?
Well, thank you so much. You know, when we were sitting in the Security Council on the evening that Russia recognized Luhansk and Donetsk and signaled the start of a war, what we were trying to do by sort of not speaking as much about that and more about African in the post-independence history and the decisions that Africa arrived at, was to indicate just how visionary and generous to the self that initial group of African leaders were. They had so little basis to live with these borders, to live with the international system, that if you're in the 1960s, the international system that submitted you to colonialism, you can feel it, it's right there. And to have had the sense that we must be able to go past this present moment, not turn on each other, and amidst all the injustice and the lack of logic of the geopolitical structures that we've been left with, let's try and make something of them. Rather than break them apart, let's try and have a vision of integrating them through respect. And we were trying to say, if Africans could live with that choice, who can't? Why would any country say it cannot live with the choices all of us have had to make? Difficult choices where we had to swallow bitter pills for the sake of peace. And we're trying to highlight how Africa responded and the difference with how Russia had responded. But not just Russia, but all the great powers over the last couple of decades who have run roughshod over international law, from the invasion of Iraq to other acts of gross international international law being broken at will by the powerful. So I think we need to begin by first addressing the desire and almost the need of dominance by the powerful. Mm-hmm. And we have to find ways, in any way, through moral pressure, through geopolitical leverage, to create a buffer between the majority of us and those who want to run roughshod over us. And here, I think Germany has a very interesting and special role to play. As a country whose wealth could be turned into a far more militaristic and domination-seeking geopolitics. But because of its awareness of its history, its constitution, its citizen sensitivity to that kind of hubris, there's something to be said about that restraint. And we need that restraint from within, driven by citizens, and also externally. And that is the basis of then building a truly decolonized international system.
Thank you so much. I just add a very small question and then I come to you. How can, when you talk about Germany, how can German development policy workers act cooperatively, really specifically in keeping in mind that we want to reduce coloniality instead of reinforcing it again and again? That's why colonial continuities is always a term.
Well, by undertaking all the complex policy actions that arise from two simple ideas. Mm-hmm. Modernization and success is not westernization, one. Mm-hmm. And two, that one size does not fit all.
Yeah.
If those two ideas are rooted in German development cooperation, it shall transform how Germany relates to the world.
Thank you very much. One applause, please. Yeah. Thank you very much. We now jump to academia. This is the first round, and then you react to each other. Here's already a reaction on the panel, but I try to introduce everybody with one question. Carla Baldibieso, your research portfolio mentions that your work encompasses a critical and multidimensional understanding of food systems, rural economies, and the autonomy of indigenous communities. How is the indispensable indigenous expertise in these sectors valued? We talked about it in the preliminary talk. When we look at the development policy context, and then second question also to empower, what has improved perhaps in the last decades? Yeah,
good afternoon, and thank you very much as well for the space here. I'm very grateful to be part of this panel as well. And I will say that inside academia, well, there are different concepts such as traditional ecological knowledge, local knowledge, situated knowledges, and so on, that have been more and more valued. And there are initiatives inside Germany, like, for example, myself, I'm part of the ATSAF Academy, that is also an academy that is working to create South-to-South collaborations with different research centers around the globe. So there are initiatives towards that. But however, which I think that is the issue into considering all of these different types of knowledge, is that when these knowledges are considered, are disattached of their political meanings and a human rights approach. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's the issue, because it's not enough with taking this local knowledge and situated knowledge and experts' knowledge from the global south, if then it's only taking like one part, the part that is not the human rights part, or the part that is, okay, like knowledge without politics. And I think that that's the tricky part, because I think that for a real empowerment, it's necessary to take this holistic knowledge as a whole, like to traditional ecological knowledge, also with the human rights, also with the defense of land, of indigenous and peasant populations, and not only as something that is different to be valued, but as a holistic sense. But I do think that there are some steps, as I said, for example, the ATSAF Academy, that in my case, I'm a fellow as well. It could be considered a good example, but I think it will be important to rethink more inside of academia, like how academia that is working with decolonization, with indigenous and peasant populations, could be seen in a more transversal way, and not only as one part of it, but how it could be transversalized over academia and politics as well.
how does our education system perpetuate colonial biases or exclude marginalized views? That's a small addition. I mean, how is it, we always discuss it also in Germany, so how are we changing curricula? How are we changing entrance? How is it, what do you think? How can we also overcome it, or what could be a first suggestion?
Yeah, I think that previously, the people that participated before the night, they were already talking about this colonial mindset that we all have, people here in the Global North, but also people in the Global South. And I think that's part of questioning the paradigms that we have, and besides the paradigms, the way of being of people. It's easier to question the ways of being than the paradigms that we have, and I think it's very important to incorporate much more critical thinking inside schools and universities, and to question constantly this idea of why Western knowledge should be the one that is validating the others. That I think that now more and more people recognizes it, but it's not as a practice yet. Because the fact that also, like myself as other Global South researchers need to come here to validate their knowledge is also part of this coloniality. Because it's not enough as being a Global South researcher in like our home countries to be valued enough, even for the development sector. But it's like, it should be this person who already has a career in their countries, and then this person needs to come to validate their knowledge here, so to be considered as somebody that has a voice.
So it's a second
And I think that shouldn't really be like that, but actually like to work like with the researchers that have like this experience in the field, in like the Global South countries, but that are also working there, and not necessarily like the people that is being validated outside for them being validated in their home countries. And I do think that it's necessary to do much more steps into that pathway.
So it's a double hinder.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So I will jump again to the next context, to the Peace Direct. Dylan Matthews, on your website, Peace Direct, on the tab on changing discriminatory systems, it says there's the assumption that peace building is historically and geographically neutral. And the perception of neutrality makes it harder for local peace builders to highlight the structural obstacles in their way. So that's the first quote, because we also had a preliminary talk. I would like to share 1 second. You told me that you interviewed more than 1,000 actors in the development sector, and so you said to me, we have a really rich source of information. And the key insight is, I quote, the way they experience the global north is fundamentally unjust and inequitable. But they don't want to lose funding and partnerships. And this is why these issues have been there for decades, as long as the sector has been there, end of quote. So when does international cooperation in human aid programs succeed despite the existing asymmetries, and when is success impossible precisely because of this imbalance? So two-part question.
Thanks, Prasanna. Very daunting question to have to answer in terms of success and failures. The first thing I wanted to say was just to explain why a peace-building organization is on this panel and why I'm talking to you here today. We've been trying for 20 years to understand how better to support local actors, people in communities on the front lines of conflict. And over those 20 years, we've consulted with hundreds, if not thousands, of organizations, and that's led us into an exploration of the dysfunctions in the system. Not the dysfunctions in peace building, the dysfunction in the wider system of international cooperation. And that led us into a very interesting piece of work which looked at issues around race and discrimination and power. And that started in 2020 and led to the publication of a report called Time to Decolonize Aid. So my shameless pitch to you is, if you haven't read it, please have a look. It is in 14 languages. It's there for you. Time to Decolonize Aid was our effort to be a conduit for hundreds of actors who said to us, the system is unjust. And it was really sobering for us. You know, I have committed my whole life to international development, international cooperation. And I was hearing for the first time how actors, local actors in the majority world of Global South, experienced us. And it wasn't a pretty picture. they said to us, you know, the way that they experience us is that we are the global north, the technical experts. Other people don't have those expertise. They feel like second-class citizens in their own country. They said, we don't even feel like we have agency in our country, because when you come into our spaces, you might talk to the governments, but you also talk to your preferred donors, and the extension of your work is through INGOs. And the INGOs have their gated compounds and their fancy four-wheel drives, and actually are an extension of, you know, the global north worldview. So we started to listen to this and started to unpick what seems to be a very, very deep-rooted problem in the sector right now. And that's, I think, the crux of your question is, you know, what does success look like and what does failure look like? What we heard was that actually we have to reconceptualize what success means. To Martin's point, you know, are we saying that success means technical outputs that lead to improved nutrition or improved education or improved healthcare? They understand that those are things that are laudable and things that we should be, you know, we should be aspiring to. But they said that in the pursuit of doing those things, you can do harm. And this is something that I think really, you know, we find difficult to wrap our heads around. In the pursuit of helping, we've actually harmed by undermining local agency, by diminishing their voice, by assuming that they have nothing to offer and that they become passive recipients of aid, which is, as Martin and others have said already. So they see that the development project is flawed. They said if we only look at success as metrics around, you know, these very technical outputs rather than a deeper understanding of how you transform relationships and you transform societies through a value-based approach, then actually we aren't going to achieve the success that we are talking about, right? So success, we have to reconceptualize it. And they talked about language, how language matters. So we talk about rethinking development policy. They said, I think we should scrap the word development. Whose development and on what terms? They talked about the use of the word beneficiary. Why do we still use the word beneficiary? So I think we actually have to start with our language, and that's based on the mindsets that we have about the knowledge that we think we have that we impart to others. So, to answer your question, the message we heard from, and we have consulted with over 1,000 activists around the world, community leaders and local organizations. They said, we know you're trying to help, but the way you're doing it is wrong. So they asked us to step back and think about a values-based approach, thinking about less of the technical focus of your work and much more about long-term transformation. And that's going to be hard for us because I think that so much of the development world focuses on short-term inputs and outputs and so little on long-term changes. And so we've really got to think about how we fundamentally reframe what we would call international cooperation. Let's not say international development. Let's say international cooperation so that it is long-term and genuinely transformational.
For long term, you need a lot of patience. I will ask you in the second round about this long term and maybe quick wins in the long term on the long term run, or it's not even a marathon, it's even much longer. But first of all, I would like to ask you, last question in the round. A few weeks ago at the Ivorian Summit of the Chamber of Commerce in Abidjan, you said, I quote, "Today we want education services without universities, banking services without banks, or healthcare services without hospitals. Digital transformation must enable us to reach areas where the infrastructure will not arrive in time." End of quote. What does the digital transformation, Mr. Kone, in African countries tell us about how to cooperate as equals in terms of potential and knowledge? And how is digital innovation challenging the old division into north-south teach-learn relationships?
Yes, thank you very much for inviting us. And I would like to really express my gratitude to the BMZ. This is a very courageous setting sessions and even events, and to talk, it takes a lot of courage to do it. First of all, in the Gen Z vocabulary, we don't use Global South. Africa is not part of Global South. Africa is a new center. The Global South is Australia and New Zealand, because Yeah, there's no Global South. Global South, Africa is not part of Global South, because if you look, before I answer your question, it's all of us here in the audience. If you just were to close your eyes, then you were told there is a big island which is about 30 point something million square kilometer. It has more than 420 companies making over $1 billion a year. It controls close to 40% of world reserve in gold. It has a vibrant youth, 70% representing less than 25. It has also 6 out of 10, best 6 out of 10 countries, best reformers by the World Bank. And you don't know the name, then the question is, will you invest in it? The answer will be yes. But if it's written in Africa, then we have a skepticism. Mm-hmm. So ourselves, we need to change that mindset. I'm talking in the perspective of digital. In the digital world, it is the sector, the transversal sector, that you don't learn it from your colonizer. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Whether you're Portuguese, you're Francophone, you're Anglophone, you don't learn it necessarily from your colonizer, because most of the time your colonizer himself, he's late. It's true. Okay. The time yes. So that's the reason when we talk about digital in Africa, we take it seriously. With the digital, we don't have to wait for the infrastructure. We want banking services without banks. It is happening on the street of Nairobi. We have M-Pesa. My grandmother never walked into a bank her entire life, but she's transacting. We need healthcare services without hospital, bricks and mortar hospital, with the telemedicine. We can learn, we can go to school with the e-education without having a physical universities in my village in Ivory Coast, which is close to 600 kilometers from the capital. That's what we're talking about. Mm-hmm. Yeah. The colonized developments touch on all of these bricks and mortar infrastructure. It's going to be hard to touch on the technology. Mm-hmm. Although we are sensing it, because when you come in terms of financing, either it's a public or a private, that's the time you hit the glass wall. Mm-hmm. Yes. So the subject we're talking about, the context back in 150 years ago, is one picture. The picture today is very, very different. We're dealing with youth populations. They have access to knowledge and information. Our grandfather did not have access to information. Had our grandfather had access to the information, do you think the colonization will happen the way it happened? No way. So we are facing a youth population, over 70% of our continent who are below 25 years old, have access to information. So that's the reason digital for us, it is not going only to allow Africa to leapfrog, it's the only way to cheetah leap. Because cheetah leap, for example, if we're all talking today about what is really trendy, which is artificial intelligence, if America is investing a lot of money in our AI systems, Europe is investing less money, but regulating a lot of the AI. China is way ahead. We believe that Africa will have the most use cases for AI than any continent. Mm-hmm. For one reason, if the AI is ethical, is inclusive, is sustainable. Because the AI will bring us inclusivity. Why? There are people out there in Africa, they don't speak English, they don't speak French, they don't speak Portuguese, but they can speak their own native language and access technology like any other education person. That is the power we're talking about. I'm going to stop here. It's going to be a very long debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Now, wenn Sie das alles hören, Frau Kofler.
Well, Ms. Kofler. Well, Ms. Kofler, having heard all that, what's on your mind? Let me go back to all this. What do you personally associate with this topic? Having listened to all these different perspectives, what are your personal ways of linking up with these topics, and in what ways does this epitomize what the Africa conference was all about? Well, I'm using my glasses because I have to rely on my notes just a little bit. I tried to write down a few things during the presentations we have heard, including from the speeches in the beginning. And it's certainly not the easier task to provide some reflections on this, because we have heard so many really important inputs that I don't even want to create a hierarchy of these inputs. I just want to highlight a few things that stuck in my mind. Well, you asked about my personal impression. One thing became very, very clear to me. We need to fundamentally change our own knowledge of the past. In Germany, I think we often pat ourselves on the shoulder for politically dealing with the past, confronting the past. Yes, we are confronting our past, the Nazi past. If you ask me, even today, still not enough if you look at recent political developments, but the past before that, which includes German colonialism and the Berlin Conference, we are not addressing that at all. A year ago, I joined the federal president for his trip to Tanzania. I had the privilege to join his delegation, including during his speech. And what was shocking, what we all found as Germans during that trip, was how little we know about the crimes which Germany committed there. I'm going to coin it that way because, if I remember correctly, over 300,000 civilians, mostly women and children, were killed during the Maji-Maji uprising. Well, what history books are there to present this? In what ways are we discussing that? And I think the beginning of many things is to honestly look at what the past was. And now this is something I am taking with me from all your input and also from my visit to Tanzania, not to stop there, because we're talking about how to shape our common future. And this, too, is the second big pillar that we have to focus on. And there was one sentence I wrote down, which I heard, and I would like to repeat it, from Ambassador Kimani. Success is a process. I found that a very good statement in your speech, because it's about sitting down together and thinking about how we can shape a process. How should international cooperation be different in the future, and how can we discuss this together? After all, this is nothing that you can just take care of through one conference, saying, well, on the 4th of December 2024 in Berlin, we discussed the matter. This can only be the starting point for a very intensive process of exchanging ideas. And the minister and I agreed that we would be happy if we could continue in office, but if we can, it would be one of the most important things to now launch a process of discussion with our partners around the world to discuss what international cooperation should look like. And I'm calling it that because I don't really like the term development cooperation. It's certainly not the term aid. But how should we shape international cooperation? And this would be the starting point. That's one of many points. I have many comments I would love to make about many things I wrote down. Maybe, if I may, I don't want to be too long, but regarding staff. And you, Mr. Matthews, raised this too, and I find this very important. The question is really, what about knowledge? What kind of knowledge is being taken seriously? What kind of expertise is being taken seriously? And one process at our ministry, and this is how we started, including with our implementing organizations, must be us taking a step back and looking at the expertise existing in the countries, because we can't pretend that there is no such thing. Of course, there is excellent scientific expertise, excellently trained experts across all partner countries and continents. and to include them in our cooperation and give them leadership responsibility on the ground for the processes of implementing projects. I think that's very important. My feeling is we have embarked on this journey, but there's still vast room for improvement, including under German budgetary law, which I would love to reform, because this too is a process that is certainly not suitable to build confidence. So it's very important to draw on this expertise. And what I mean is really the local technical expertise. We don't always have to invent that. It's there locally. So we have to create opportunities, strengthen networks, and so on. Making headway on that, I think that's our task. Well, you made me smile. Mr. Kone had already picked up on one painful point. Digital technology isn't exactly our key competence here in Germany either. So we could think, well, we could learn. Well, anyone who has been sitting on a German train and desperately trying to get an internet connection or even a phone connection, yes. Well, there's one question I want to take back to you regarding staff. And as I said in the beginning, we want to engage with diasporas and with German civil society. What we are doing here, what does that mean for our internal processes in the BMZ? We heard a little bit about that in your speech. Well, we launched the process at the ministry a little over a year ago, I think. Not just at the ministry, but together with the implementing agencies, that is GIZ and KfW. And I think at the beginning, the conference that was the kickoff for all this, there was a lot of thinking about how do we go about this? Well, there's a lot that needs to be changed, but how do we go about it? This is really a process which you embark on. And at the time, we identified 5 points, because I think this shows the breadth of things we talk about. It starts with non-discriminatory communication and language. And language has been highlighted in many contexts in the last hour. But the question of interrelation also has to do with recruiting. If you don't do this properly, nobody will be interested in getting involved in the working processes of such an institution. So this is a point too. Then it is about sensitizing our staff, and I mean all of us. I consider all of us as staff who require this kind of sensitization. It's a bottom-up process where knowledge and experience of the staff plays a role. And of course, it has to play a role in our recruitment processes, so that what we endeavor to live is reflected in our own staff. Which has to do a lot with improving our processes with our partners. So if we change our own speech patterns, this is something that we will be measured against. Then what I said earlier, partner orientation and implementation of our projects. So we're present worldwide through our organizations, and it needn't always be the German expert who is on the ground, if I may carefully say this now without knowing what this will entail in terms of staffing legislation. But the point is to rely on the very expertise which exists in our partner countries, vastly exists, and give them leadership responsibility, so that in our institutions on the ground, there should be leadership responsibility as a matter of course for people who, in addition, have the cultural and linguistic competency for working in their countries. And then 2 very short moments, but I think this is very important too. We want to strengthen dialogue and partnership. We want to jointly launch suitable processes, which is why I'm saying that after this conference we need the next steps in terms of how we should really go about this. And Ambassador Kimani, you said at the beginning, your speech must be reflected well. We also need to mirror our process and align it with what is being discussed among our partners. And it has to be brought into all our multilateral work and discuss it with other partners in order to reduce these asymmetries. So it's a long list. Yes, the list is long, and it hasn't become any shorter as a result of this discussion. Well, Ms. Kofler, you stay with us. I'm moving on to the second round.
Term of patience and long durations. Mr. Kimani, you have been in the diplomatic service and policy consulting for many, many years, and you're experienced in having stamina because many transformation challenges, as we have heard, take a long time. What can be, in your view, what can be quick wins in an acknowledgement or in an appreciative cooperation?
Well, I'm a recovering civil servant, and until just a few months ago, I was a diplomat for Kenya, and that's why I very much appreciate the holding of this event on the level of government bureaucracy being open to thinking in this way. It's quite unusual. And I want to say, just before I answer your question, something very quick to sort of address an elephant in the room. First, we must not underestimate the political forces in Europe that regard the conversation we're having as blasphemy, that regard this conversation as a way to make Germans feel guilty and feel like they're bad people. And it stops there. But in fact, we have to go beyond that and argue that this is not about creating guilt. This is rather about unlocking possibilities that are so powerful and useful for us all. Today, if you go to most African countries and say, I want to invest €1 billion now, you won't get takers. The absorption capacity of capital is so low because of how the economy works, how it's governed, and how it's related to. So for you to invest 100 billion euros, €500 billion, you require a transformed relationship, transformed dynamics. And when they do get transformed, you will win greatly, as much as we in Africa will win greatly. So the work of decolonization is not the work of creating guilt, self-flagellation, pointing fingers, etc. Rather, it's radical work of opening up possibilities and opportunities for all of us. And that's why it's going to be so important, on top of the language we use for international cooperation, to be very careful about the political language we use for decolonization, because we do not want this process of recovery and revitalization to become a cultural war in Europe. I don't want the way Germany relates within itself to have Kenya unable to engage productively with German industry, with German government, because the political forces in Germany are kicking the football of the word decolonization back and forth. So I think we need to be politically sophisticated. We need to go beyond finger pointing. And for us Africans especially, and I liked my brother, Mr. Kone, talking about digital and that leap, is that we also, on our side in Africa, need to also have a good, hard look at ourselves and see how are we governing our own countries? How are we raising a generation of leaders who are equal to the task of making an African country be able to absorb $50 billion of investment over the next 3 years?
I just, even if we didn't speak about quick wins, I just take this question of guilt. Guilt is not a good consultant. And I just pass it over to Mr. Kone, because you were nodding the whole time, and I think you should just bring your own.
Absolutely.
It's on.
Yes. We should not feel guilty. I think we should be very honest. First of all, it takes a lot of courage to do this sessions, and I'm here listening to you and the courage a lot from a BMZ. We're facing the reality. You see, our generations, I will say it here, our generations, technically I can say it, I've never been colonized. I'm born after 1960. That was my grandfather. That is exactly the mentality of the Gen Z. When you talk about coloniality, they don't know. So there's no guilt about it. They grew up and they see technologies happening. And whether you like it or not, today, Africa is a mobile-first continent generating $822 billion in 2022 in transaction value, bigger than any bank in the world. So if we all start with the decolonizing, in my part, I really believe that decolonizing development and knowledge is essential. Not only development, decolonizing the developments and the knowledge. Because
it's a cross-cutting issue.
Absolutely. One thing my brother said, Ambassador said, we need to mirror his speech. We do have people also on our continent who has a syndrome, I call it a systemic syndrome. You're independent, but you act like someone who's not independent. Yes, the German can go ahead with the steps to rename development into, I will call it, a new partnership model. But on the other side, we must truly believe that the past is behind us, that we're looking forward. We don't have to play a role of the victim. I've been colonized, yes. So what? So what's next to do? And I say it all the time. Most of us here, when we were growing up, we used to go to churches or mosque or synagogue. You're not the one who built it. Someone thought about it before you and built those mosques and churches. So what are we going to do for our future generations? Is to actually impact or reduce the impact of that mindset of the other mirror side in order for current generation to face the future. So that's a double responsibility. How are we thinking ourselves? When we look at all the vertical sectors today on our continent, agriculture, education, healthcare, transportation, all of that is stagnating. Digital is thriving, but the power it takes, the effort it takes to convince our leaders that digital is not a vertical. It is the vertical, the transversal vertical. We face a lot of systemic syndrome. Thank you.
Dylan Matthews wanted to react, but I just wanted to drop in one question for you, because we talked about it just in the room before. When we talk about digital, you were also mentioning, but we have to focus on critical thinking, so especially for the Gen Z. So I just wanted to pass this over, and then I come to you.
Yes, thank you very much. And I also wanted to react, actually, doing some critical thinking to what has been said, is also that I think like the word decolonization itself needs to be uncomfortable, to be a real decolonization. And I think that, okay, like, it's not that we need to feel guilty. Like myself, I also have like, part of myself is also like internally colonialized. But I have to say that, of course, it's important to feel that uncomfortability, because that's what makes us move. If I wouldn't think that I'm like internally colonialized, I wouldn't move. I will feel comfortable in the place that I am. But actually, like thinking on that and thinking like, okay, like I feel uncomfortable, then that makes me do different steps to transform something. And it's not that, I mean, I think that that should be the center of thinking about decolonization, which for me is itself, questioning things, doing critical thinking, also dismantling things, rebuilding things. So both things, like, decentering the power, shifting the power, but also like rebuilding. So not only critiquing, but feeling uncomfortable, but also rebuilding what has been dismantled through that critical thinking, let's say. So I do see a role in feeling uncomfortable in the one hand, and returning to what you said about information and also the critical thinking, I do think that people now has much more information than before. But I do think as well that it's more difficult to have like a critical thinking than before as well because of that magnitude of information. Because a lot of information is around, it's a lot of, like young generations might be also tempted to read so much, but reading what and with what eyes? So I also think that the academia there plays a major role because having this critical thinking and seeing things through the eyes of decolonization is very important, and not only thinking that everything that is online is good, or as soon as we read something, we assume that is a truth. But actually, academia should be there as well, like to play a role and to question things, and also to feel uncomfortable and to see beyond that uncomfortability to create and transform.
So there's still a lacking position which has to be filled in. But first of all, you just, okay, but Dylan Matthews, yeah, just one sentence and then, okay.
Before I forget,
we negotiate.
You know, when Mr. Corner is talking about the digital, there's one big win that needs to happen right now. And that is essentially to vastly expand the training data sets that AI is using to encompass more African languages, more.
Definitely.
This is brute work that is very capital intensive, and there's no clear business model yet how to do it, but this is work that is waiting to be done that is a big win if it's done.
Thank you very much for that. That was really almost one sentence and very nice. Thank you. Dylan Matthews, please.
Thank you. I wanted to respond to two things that have been said. The first is the question around quick wins. Let's reframe that and not talk about quick wins, because this is patience. Patience is necessary. But let's talk about first steps. So we're making tentative steps towards a new way of relating to each other. So quick wins, I think, is part of the problem, you know, that development has had. We need to have impact quickly. We need to do things quickly to demonstrate that we've somehow achieved some sort of goal, arbitrary goal that we've set ourselves. So let's talk about some tentative first steps. Let me respond to Dr. Koffler's points that you made around the changes that you have started to encourage within BMZ. When we consulted, we held our first global consultation on this issue around structural and systemic racism almost 5 years ago. We invited participants to come up with a manifesto. So rather than just expressing how frustrated they were, we asked them to come up with a manifesto for how the system should look differently. And they came up with 8 different recommendations. Please don't quiz me on all 8, I can't remember all 8. But I can remember at least 4 of them. The first one was acknowledge the problem. Acknowledge the problem of structural and systemic racism, and that actually you have done harm. This forum right now is an acknowledgement of the problem. Don't underestimate just how difficult that is to do in some places. I have spoken to governments, at least 6 or 7 governments and over 100 INGOs. Most of them don't want to have that conversation. So the first is that. The second one is encourage a culture of critique within your organization. Don't self-censor or don't censor others to have conversations that are uncomfortable. Back to that point about discomfort. That was the second one. So how can we create a culture within our organizations where we can examine where we might have gone wrong? The third one was mind your language. Reassess the language that we use. Now, and the fourth one was recruit differently. What they said when we consulted, they said, you seem to recruit the same kind of people from the same universities who then are shipped overseas to manage country offices or embassies who have little experience, lived experience of the issues that we're dealing with. So they said, please try and be a bit more diverse in your recruitment practices. Those are the first 4, and all 4 I think you mentioned. Yeah. So I think that there's, let's not talk about them as quick wins, but let's talk about them as first steps. Those first steps are absolutely critically important. And the last thing to say is, I have spoken to hundreds of organizations who won't take any step because they're paralyzed. They're paralyzed about making a mistake, so they don't take any step. Now, we are going to make mistakes as we try to embark on decolonizing the sector and decolonizing international cooperation. We have to be brave enough to accept that we might make mistakes, because if we don't do that, we won't take any step, and we have to take some steps.
Before I ask Dr. Kofler for her next response, I just wanted to address one other elephant in the room, which you already mentioned. Thank you for taking up the provocant word quick wins, or this term. But in this situation, in this political situation, we talked about it in the preliminary talk, we are also facing taxpayers' money. And this is we always have to justify what we are spending the money for. So this is why we have this problem with the patience and the long term, and we need to address or define quick wins. You are so experienced, Dylan, in terms of justifying money also to governments, to taxpayers. What would you suggest?
Well, I think the first thing, we have discussed this with governments, with multilateral bodies, with INGOs. I think what we've said is that the desire to transform the sector has to be seen through a different lens, one which we are not just talking about effectiveness. If you think about the current framing of issues, it's around effectiveness or cost effectiveness. And actually those things are important, but we're also talking about the moral imperative here, that this is morally and ethically the right thing to do. And what we've said is that in some instances, that's actually quite a difficult conversation to have right now, because when you have governments that are shifting to the right, actually arguing the moral case is not easy anymore. Maybe it never was easy arguing the moral case. So what we've said is that actually you have to take a sort of mixed approach. This is not only the morally and ethically right thing to do, but it also does lead to better outcomes for the communities that we're trying to serve. Let's remember that. So all of the work that we've been trying to do, us in the audience have been trying to do, has been with that in mind. We have been trying to say this is for the best interests of communities. Actually, if we decolonize our thinking and our practice, we relinquish control and power and hand some of that control and power over to those communities and those organizations who are actually living that experience, there will be better outcomes. Now, that's an argument that actually works with the taxpayer, because they understand that actually, all the intermediaries aren't always that useful. If you think about, for example, the funding that goes to civil society around the world, 93% of all funding for CSOs goes to INGOs. So we looked at the data from the OECD. 93% of all funding for CSO work around the world is channeled through INGOs. Only 7% goes directly to local organizations. So there are arguments that I think we can use that actually speak to whichever political persuasion you're at, in terms of, this is going to lead to better outcomes. And surely that's an argument that is difficult to dispute.
Thank you very much. Frau Kofler. Ich habe ja nicht ohne Grund gesagt, dass dieses
Ms. Kofler, it was not without reason that I said that you have so much experience as a member of parliament. And now we have touched upon this very question. In the context of the BMZ, you have been through difficult times regarding justifying your work, handling criticism from civil society and things that have been on the news regarding investments made in development cooperation. What is it that you take with you from this round strategically? Mr. Kimani also talked about placing this issue strategically.
Well, I'd like to underline what I said about processes. I think we need to get to a point where we have a different narrative. Also, in Germany, and I also discussed it with Mr. Kone, we need a narrative that also explains positive changes through international cooperation, positive for all sides, because everyone involved is going through a process of change and learning through international cooperation, to put it simply. So telling these success stories wherever possible. That's something that we need in order to get people on board, because sometimes it's a very complex discourse. And of course it must be complex, because at the end of the day, I mean, I don't want to bore you with the nitty-gritty of German budgetary law, but at the end of the day, the ultimate question is how do we provide proof for our funding and its effectiveness, and it doesn't just refer to the BMZ, and it's not an easy task, because obviously you are dealing with partners that have a different set of rules. And it's sometimes very complex to bring different systems together, which is one of the reasons why it is so difficult for us to provide direct support to local NGOs in our partner countries. And I'd welcome such a step, but we need to find a good balance between complying with German budgetary law and new approaches, new thinking. Well, it's a difficult tightrope walk politically, and we need majorities for that, political majorities as well. What I'm taking home from this discussion, and this really encourages me, everyone kept saying, don't focus on quick wins. Patience is important, medium-term, long-term transformation processes, that's what we need. And all countries are going through these transformation processes. We all need to deal with digitalization. We have a new world of work, globalization, and sometimes there's a lack of a global framework for globalization. We're all dealing with the impacts of climate change, and how do we deal better with the next pandemic, for example? That's questions that all countries are facing worldwide. And if we now look at structural problems and identify them, maybe it's administrative problems, and they were mentioned several times today, or transparency issues, or what about digital technologies? What can new technologies play? What about finance, transparent accounting, tax revenues? That's something that's not just relevant in our partner countries, it's also important for every country, including in Germany. What tools can we identify? I mean, we're having this tedious debate on VAT, for example. We saw it in Kenya. So we need a just and fair tax system. And I think the billionaires' tax was on in this tag cloud earlier on during the Mentimeter survey. So we need our citizens to see that they actually have a benefit if we invest in health, infrastructure, education, etc. So these are structural questions that we all need to deal with in all of our countries. And it's important to understand transformation processes in a certain way. And our ministry could be called a transformation ministry, couldn't it? We could see ourselves as a transformation ministry. How can we accompany and support international transformation processes? That's really an exciting question. I mean, of course, you can't do that during an electoral term of 4 years. Well, it's a long-term goal, isn't it? And we need a consensus among Democrats. And we used to have that consensus that it's right to work together internationally, that we'll always be making mistakes. But by the way, the scandal was not about our mistake or my mistake. There was a certain title that was turned into a scandal. But we need a consensus among Democrats that we need international cooperation for the benefit of others, but also for our own benefit. And it's in our own interest to pursue international cooperation. And I think something that we need to ensure that we have this consensus. Yes, and you're raising an issue that we've been talking about several times. We're talking about communication at different levels. So how are we communicating? How are we talking about how we spend our money? And how do we communicate what happens to that money or with that money? What about outcomes at a project management level? So thank you very much for raising these important issues.
You have a break for 10 minutes, but you can also participate in the next format. This is up to you. You can also just sit here and chat. You can't. Und jetzt switche ich einmal. Jetzt kommen
And now I'll switch back to German, because now we'll start with our next participatory format.
Wir würden Sie gerne jetzt in genau das schicken, was wir heute so viel gehört
We would like to have you engage in dialogue now. We've been talking a lot about dialogue. Well, you will now turn to the person sitting to your left, and if there's no one sitting to your left, you may take the next chair. Well, it would be great if you could get together in pairs. So we'd now like to ask you to do a dialogue exercise. And we want you to practice being a listener. So you have 3 times 3 minutes. And you'll set the timer on your smartphone. And you will first listen to the other person. Listen to what the other person has to say about this panel and their insights and learning. So try not to nod, try not to shake your head. And then the other person has 3 minutes to talk. And the other person, well, this second person doesn't refer to what the other person said, what the first person said. You just talk about yourselves. And I have a guess, in the last 3 minutes, you're free to have an open conversation. Why are we doing this? Well, our experience is that people have clear questions when we do this before our Q&A session. So we'll have an official Q&A round after this dialogue exercise, and then we'll hear the final statements from our panelists. Well, understood? Okay, now time's running. So what are your learnings, your insights? What are your takeaways from this discussion? And please don't start a discussion right now. Listen to one another, please.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, you can chat with each other. should start. Okay, yeah. Thank you. So, jetzt haben wir. Other. Yeah, last 3 minutes, and then we come back here. So. So, jetzt müsstet ihr mich wieder anmachen.
All right.
Sie müssten zum Ende kommen.
You would now have to round off your discussion. Ms. Kofler, Parliamentary State Secretary Kofler, I need you back on the stage, actually.
Ganz brutal.
So I have to be brutal and interrupt you. So I don't have a bell. No, we'll now return to the plenary. So it's wonderful to see you engage in discussions. And I heard earlier on the panel that, well, time flew by, and I feel the same. But we really need enough time, and we really want to take enough time for your questions. So you could also participate in the discussion in the Q&A session by asking your questions via the Mentimeter website. I'll see them here on my screen. I'm really sorry, I have a cold. That's why I'm eating a pill, for my cold. So we'd really be grateful to you. Well, we have two colleagues, Janine and Maike, they have microphones. And it would be great if you could ask questions and not really make any comments, and really tell us who your question is directed at. I know it's difficult with these topics and other settings. I'm saying it very bluntly, no co-speeches, please. I won't tell you that, but it's really important for us to take as many questions as possible. So if you have a question, please tell us your name and who your question is directed at. So I can't see the person, but you'll join him or her with your roving mic. Michael Küpper, Cybernovitz. I initiated the first decolonized memorial in Germany that was just inaugurated in Berlin-Neukölln. My question is the following. Why are there no representatives from Togo, Tanzania, Cameroon, Namibia? But I don't know who to ask, actually. Well, it can't be directed at me, so maybe Parliamentary State Secretary Kofler wants to comment. Well, I have to be honest, I personally don't know. I'm certain that there must be a reason that I can't tell you right now. I don't want to tell you any nonsense at this point. I'm sure that it's not that we didn't want to have representatives from these countries here up on the stage. For us, it was really important to have high-ranking and very experienced panelists. And I don't know precisely how the selection was made. But of course, we can take up your suggestion for the next time to explicitly have people on the stage from countries that were affected by German colonial rule, that experienced German colonial rule, and try to invite people from those countries to the panel. Here's a question over there, another question. You really need to raise your hand. So a question here, over here, and then here up the front.
Thank you very much. My name is Lamolon Sanja, and I'm from the KfW Malawi office. So just to respond to the previous speaker, I mean, there are representatives from Africa in the crowd, so we do get a chance at least to comment during this session. So it's not like we're completely unrepresented. I have a comment which I'll turn into a question. I think all of us like evidence. We like basing our decisions on evidence. And I think this discussion, we can draw evidence from other aspects of life. So in Europe, many European countries, in the United States, there was a time when also societies felt that we would not advance if women were included in development. But we're all wiser now, we're more advanced, and we realize that if women are included in development, we move further along. And men's development and women's development is not mutually exclusive, and this could apply as well to the same discussion we're having now. So when Europe develops, when America develops, that does not preclude Africa's development. We can all move forward together. And then I also wanted to quickly pose a question to Dr. Kofler. In German aid, BMZ has mainstream topics which are very important to them, which are priorities. So for example, we do mainstreaming of gender, we do mainstreaming of climate adaptation, and so on. And you've even developed markers to assess how well projects are doing in these mainstreaming aspects. So if a project is doing very well in gender transformation, it's labeled GG2. If it's not doing so well, it's GG0. And those markers help us to be accountable. We have the same markers for climate adaptation as well. So as a next step for your consideration, if this topic is really important for BMZ and Germany, you could decide to develop markers for it as well. So if you have a program, or if German development aid in general is not doing so well on colonial decolonization, that could be labeled as a 0 classification. And those would also help you to be held accountable. And we can mutually hold each other accountable as well through markers like that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Kofler, wollen Sie darauf nochmal reagieren?
Should I answer in English now? Because simply that we have a direct conversation. I do so. You don't need a headphone now. Soll ich auf Deutsch machen? Ja, dann mache ich es auf Deutsch.
Okay, I'll do it in German. If you now already have your headphones, that's fine. I'll do it in German. First of all, this was an important comment, the question relating to women and feminist development policy or gender-based policy, because that's an important aspect that you could include. And sometimes there are overlaps, really, between the two topics. And it was on one of the charts previously, the word women was not big enough for me in the Mentimeter survey, because if we really want to achieve a genuine transformation, we need to include all groups. And that's an important aspect, really. The marker itself that you mentioned, it's a technical aid, a technical tool to create transparency, but it's also an important tool to promote the discussion on the topic. And that's something we should think about, because when we talk about markers, we also think of criteria. How do we want to move forward on the topic of decolonizing development policy? So if you have a marker and can make things transparent and comparable, that's a good thing. But of course, that's really the end of the debate. I think we've only just started the debate. I think there's a lot of debate that will be needed. And we need to listen to one another, and we need to find a clear definition on the successes that we want to achieve with regard to decolonizing cooperation. So having verifiable and tangible markers, well, it's a good idea, I think. Well, thank you very much for this question. We'll come to you.
Thank you. Joshua Kwesi-Akins from the Africa Policy Research Institute. My question is for Ambassador Kimani and for Ms. Kofler. So, Ambassador Kimani, you, in your keynote, you very clearly identified colonial continuities and strictures that arise from them for global relations, North-South relations, European-African relations today. My question is about maybe what you could call the neo-coloniality of development and of North-South relations, particularly when it comes to policy space in the Global South. And this regards particularly, just to give one example, let's say debt service, right? So if we know that the countries we're talking about, many of them pay so much more in debt servicing, then they have space in their budget for health and education combined. Then we see that the policy space is really rather small, And I would argue that the reason for this is also an emanation of colonial or neo-colonial continuities, which then, when we turn this around to asking about decolonizing development, turns into a question of policy incongruency. So I love this idea of, this being a ministry of transformation. So my question is, how would decolonizing development or international relations look like if Germany took the policy incongruencies emanating from just Germany's federal ministries seriously? What would you do, or what would you advise? How should the BMZ decolonize the actions of the German economic ministry, the EU trade posture, and other policy areas?
Thank you very much for this question. Yeah, applause. Would you, who starts? This was a question for you, suggestion, and then you just finalize.
That's a very difficult question, and that's why you asked it. Thank you for that, very generous. Let's begin by, Germany is Europe's wealthiest country. And I think Germany over the years has played a smaller size than its true size in European policy towards Africa. Across the Sahel, some of the developments have really put one European country in the toughest spot. And I think Germany needs to resist European policy towards Africa being controlled or dominated by any one European country. Because that country may not have the interests of Europe at large, it's just extending and using the European platform to further its forms of, to put it lightly, neo-colonial continuities, right? So Germany can do more to make sure that European policy reflects the conversation we're having today. On the issue of debt, I don't want to make the fiscal crisis in Africa to necessarily be an emanation directly of colonialism. They're first low savings rate for a variety of reasons, poor choices in the projects that we choose to invest in, the high rate of debt because of the way the rating agencies. Germany could do more, for instance, to ensure that there's the sorts of regulations that were put on ratings agencies after the 2008 global financial crisis. A lot of those regulations had to do with how those ratings agencies operate in developed country markets. So their transparency, their ability and expertise, these were expected to change for the United States, for Europe, but no one reformed how they relate to poorer countries. So a quick example is all of us were in the same boat. One, the same 3 or 4 agencies said that these mortgage-backed instruments that were flying all over the place were AAA rated. But they should not have been AAA rated. They basically slept on the job with catastrophic results. The very same ratings agencies say that African debt is irredeemable, right? Mm-hmm. And in both instances, there have to be public bailouts of the banks, public bailouts of distressed assets in rich countries, and then now public bailouts being demanded by African countries, again, because of how debt is structured. So I think Germany can do a lot more to work with African countries on how debt is restructured. Third, international tax policy. I have been disappointed to see Germany at the UN voting against the African position that global tax reform needs to be global, needs to include all of us. And the attempt by the OECD to basically capture global tax policy. There are a lot of pragmatic and good proposals within the OECD framework, no doubt about it. But the ability for African countries and other poorer countries to retain more tax from the global companies that operate in our countries is really key to us being able to generate more revenue for our governments. And the more revenue we're able to generate, the less we need to borrow, the less aid money we need. We need to keep more of our own money. So Germany can change its position on global tax reform. And I think we need to make it tougher for the people who structurally and systematically attempt to corrupt and capture African states. African states, as I have said, are very porous, and many times African politicians have perverse incentives to actually mismanage the way the state is supposed to run. A lot of the winnings of that illicit game are stored in different offshore centers here in Europe. In fact, in one famous ex-EU member. And I'm no longer a diplomat.
Okay.
I'm no longer a diplomat. So that is to say, Europe needs to make it a lot harder for those who defraud, who steal, and divert illegitimate sources of income anywhere in the world, and to use Europe's worldwide ability to issue sanctions and to undertake financial transparency to help Africa keep more of its own revenues and more of its own money.
Thank you very much for this answer. There's a lot of pity on the stage right now for one panelist, but he doesn't represent this
yeah,
member.
that was about the
ex-EU member. Yeah, of course.
That's fine.
Is why I just wanted to transport why we were laughing.
I really want to be brief because Entschuldigung, ich möchte wirklich sehr kurz machen. Wir können vielleicht ja noch länger uns.
I'd really like to be brief, and we can, of course, discuss this later on bilaterally here in Berlin. Ambassador Gabani has mentioned some very important points. It's really about establishing tax systems, global taxation, fighting illicit flows, and another important aspect is one often mentioned by the minister, a global billionaires tax. That's one example that you can use, one tool you can use to generate additional resources and revenues in countries around the world. And countries where you have to invest a lot in money that you can use to invest, make major investments in health systems, education systems, etc., and that applies to all countries worldwide. It's about sustainable financial flows for important public tasks. So fighting illicit financial flows and tax evasion and base erosion, profit shift, that's also an important aspect, base erosion, profit shifting. And access to financial markets is important, and Ambassador Kamani talked a lot about that. And in June of next year, we'll have the Financing for Development Conference in Sevilla, so the question of international financial architecture will play an important role there. Yes, we need to change our systems, and for me, it would be great if the German attitude were to change in terms of the international tax architecture. So I think it would be beneficial for everyone involved if Germany were to rethink its position. And when it comes to debt relief, well, we'll try to do this via a common framework. Maybe we need a bit more time for that. I'm really trying to hurry up here because we need to involve other stakeholders and players, China, for example, because China is the creditor of most, debitor of most debt, indebted countries. And we also need to ensure that everything is development compatible, pro-development, which is why I'm a big fan of, for example, human rights and social, environmental obligations along supply chains. And I'm talking about obligations that European, German, international companies have also towards the people in the countries, so that people have decent jobs, different living conditions and working conditions. That's also something where we need coherence. And that's also one of the key tasks of the BMZ. We're really lobbying for that, and there's room for improvement. I would clearly say that this is true. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Kufler.
Then I have to continue. Please,
tout le monde. Mon nom est Louise Nzanga-Ramazani. Je suis l'ambassadeur de la République de
My name is Louise. I'm the ambassador for the Democratic Republic of the Congo in Germany. I'm doing this in French because I speak French better. What's going on with translation? Does anybody need a headphone? Can I speak in French? There is English translation, yes.
Madame Koffler, aujourd'hui, on ne parlera pas de la violence.
Ms. Koffler, today we're not discussing violence against women. That is what we discuss so often, but today is about a different topic, decolonization. Well, I would like to thank the minister very much. I want to thank Germany for the courage and sincerity and transparency, your honesty and sincerity about everything that has happened in the past. We must not leave it at this. I'm currently reading something about Otto von Bismarck, who was called the Iron Chancellor at the time. And the federal president asked for forgiveness during his visit. We thank him for that. Well, what is the plan? What is Germany planning? Is Germany planning practical actions to address the historical injustice that was brought about by the Berlin Conference, going beyond symbolic questions for asking for forgiveness? Couldn't Germany very practically give compensation to the descendants of the victims of colonization? Well, and the moderator asked me to be brief. So my second question is youth and diaspora. In Germany, how is Germany integrating young African leaders and diaspora in its international strategy for development cooperation? Maybe Ms. Koffler could answer this question, or Mr. Kimani might be able to say something about this too. That was my question. So, Ms. Koffler, well, I'm starting with the second question, because I can say a little bit more about that regarding youth, especially from the African context, but not just the African context, of course, and diaspora here in Germany, because we consider this extremely important. Here at the BMZ, we are eager to have the experience of people from different countries inform our processes. I have a very good example of an organization, not just of young people, but people from the African continent based in Bavaria, where I come from, who are sharing ideas about how, for instance, labor migration can be shaped, how integration can be fostered, and how all this can become part of lawmaking processes in Germany. And these are things that our ministry, as long as it's responsible for this kind of thing, can pick up or take up with the lead ministries for this in order to have policy coherence and put these people in touch with the lead ministries. And I think we have created good contexts in this regard. And I think this is an area where we can get a good idea of what is needed and have people listen to the voices of diaspora. Well, and Ambassador, I have to apologize. There are some things I simply don't know. I'm unfortunately unable to say anything about this at present, but I can come back to you on this and have a personal conversation with you on this. Well, thank you very much for this question and answer. And this is the last question we're accepting, and then we have to do the final round because we're behind the schedule.
I'm Ari from the BMZ Youth Advisor Council, so I have many questions, but I will just ask one, and I will be not that creative and just ask the question that a lot of young people ask in this room. Yeah. So one of the panelists described Africa as youth-centered space or youth center, and spoke about the role of young people in these processes, particularly in international cooperation. But how can we, as global community, you work to shift and decolonize like the education system mindset, but also what role do young generation play in this? Are you here in Germany, Europe, but also globally making an effort to include young people at every level, local, national, and international? And if yeah, how? So, and where do we, like as young people, stand in this discussion today? And where are the young people both today and also every day in these rooms, spaces, and processes? So I don't see a lot of young people here, so I wanted to address that.
Thank you very much for addressing this issue. I take two panelists because you didn't address, or did I miss that? Because I would ask Carla and Dylan Matthews. Perhaps we start with Dylan and then Carla.
Thank you. What I would say, the first thing I would say is that when we look at colonial continuities, what we are talking about is attitudes and practices that diminish the agency of others, that place the power in the hands of certain groups at the expense of others. When you look at Sub-Saharan Africa, Asia, Middle East, there are certain groups that actually are disproportionately affected by that. So when we've had consultations, I mentioned the first consultation we had on decolonizing aid, young women said, you know, generally speaking, those in the global south or majority world feel like second-class citizens. If you're a woman, you feel like a third-class citizen. If you're a young woman, you feel like a fourth-class citizen. So actually, they talked about this hierarchy, and actually, there were certain groups that really felt absolutely disadvantaged by the system. So I think when we talk about decolonizing, we are also talking about stripping away and really dismantling those practices and those attitudes and placing power back in the hands of those who absolutely should be leading those agendas. And that, I think, is a really difficult process for most funders and policymakers, because most funders and policymakers still have an assumption that their expertise counts more than other expertise, particularly when it comes to young people. So I think there's an enormous barrier that we still need to get over, which is this notion that policymaking should be done to other people, rather than with them or allowing them to lead those efforts. So there's no easy solution to that. I think decolonizing international cooperation inevitably means placing power in the hands of those who haven't had that power. And for young people in the room and for young people listening, that does mean them. We have to figure out how we do that in ways that actually are genuinely empowering rather than performative. I think there's a lot of performative actions that take place right now. We say some nice words, we make a small grant program for young people, and that we think that's sufficient. That isn't sufficient. But I think that, again, the first thing is acknowledging that we have those problems is the first way to actually making some progress towards that. And I have seen that in places, you know, where in Peace Direct's experience, there's a UN resolution on youth, peace and security. We've seen how that has actually translated to funding. But what we have heard is also it's insufficient, and it's still very piecemeal. So we need to have these integrated conversations with various development ministries. It's going to take time. Again, there's no quick win here. It's going to take time.
To open up, yeah, thank you very much. And Carla Padivezio.
Yeah, thank you. I think that is a very, very interesting and important question. I think that it's important to look back at the universities as well. I think that there is a lot of effort put there also by activist groups at the universities here in Germany and also in other parts of the world. And people doing a lot of activism related to rights, advocacy of rights, and that should be really considered. And I think also coming back to this idea of validation of knowledge, like this idea of validation of knowledge is also connected to the idea that people that is old, that people that has a lot of experience is the one that is allowed or entitled to speak. And that's not always the case. And there are like so many new ideas that are coming from universities, as I said, here in Germany and other parts of Germany that need to be considered as well. And also beyond universities, activism groups that mostly are made, or usually are made also by young populations that are with these dreams in mind of what things could change. They are not as much into the system, and that's why they have all of those new ideas. When people is already old and they tend to be very inside of the system, then it's much more difficult to bring creativity. Then if there is not young people there, like from where are we trying to create new solutions? That could be also a contradiction in itself. So
talking with them, not talking about them, is one issue which we always have, and we take it home also today. Thank you very much for your engaged questions, for your expertise also in the audience. I have to close this round now because we are already running out of time. First of all, before I just ask you all for a brief answer, please, for in the final statement. Frau Kofler, I would start with you at this point because your colleague from the BMZ will also finalize. So just a brief vision. What are we looking at in 2040 in the BMZ? What would be your vision of change, transformation 15 years from now, almost?
Well, I think, Entschuldigung, ich glaube, ich habe das eigentlich in den verschiedenen Beiträgen schon gesagt. Ich würde mir wirklich wünschen, dass wir miteinander einen
Well, I said it before, I would really hope and wish for us to initiate a transformation process together. I think all countries worldwide are in the midst of a transformation process and dealing with transformation issues and questions. I think we should shape this transformation together. We should do it with respect, and we've had a discussion that was characterized by respect today. I would really wish for us to continue the debate that we started today, and that we don't have to wait for 20 years until this debate bears fruit, and that we have a change in mindset soon, and that we really start a process together to initiate change process, transformation process over the long run. So a big round of applause for Bärbel Kofler.
I would like to ask you, what will learning setups and consulting routines look like in the context of global challenges such as climate change, digitalization, and migration 15 years from now?
Thank you very much for the question. It's a very short answer. 15 years is too long, because it's too
15
long.
is too long. Okay.
It's too long. A normal life cycle to penetrate the market is like a 3-2. When you look at TikTok and Meta, all that, it's about 3 to 4 years. So 15 years is too long. 15 is actually everything will be probably, certainly automated.
Certainly, we will use it, and
exactly for learning experiences. Like for learning, it's going to be just immersions and collaborations, basically, because the artificial intelligence today can allow every single one to learn at its own pace. You don't need to learn at the pace of the others. And if you look at the global ratio, actually, if there's a lot of there's a lot of lack of literacy in Africa, and if we're able to adapt to the AI, it basically means illiterate people who were considered to be illiterate in Africa will no longer be illiterate. They will know how to use the technology. And in the next 10, 15 years, you will be seeing a lot of knowledge being learned from Africa because of the use cases which will not exist in Europe.
Definitely. Thank you very much. Now, I must excuse because I haven't taken in the digital voices, and I would like to change my last question to you and take the last question for Mr. Kimani. What can be done to overcome patriarchal norms in the global south, which have been often cemented by colonial structures? Do you want to answer that? That's a nice one. That's a nice one.
Enable women to become rich.
That's a very brief answer. Okay. Have you seen that? Thank you. Thank you very much. One applause for Martin Kimani and one applause for Lassina Kone. Sorry. So, last question to Carla Baldivieso. What needs to change in higher academic education over the next 15 years in terms of global equity? You have said a lot, but just to put it short.
I think it's important to support more endogenous processes of social learning and more grassroots processes. I think that sometimes that still like this idea of Western knowledge is very entrenched in all the universities, and actually it's important to see that there is a lot happening in the grassroots, and it's not necessary to create the wheel and to bring those solutions, but more like to support what is already there, and universities also should be focused on that.
Thank you very much. One huge applause for Carla Baldi-Pieso and Dylan Matthews. How will we have advanced by 2040? It's too long, I know, but still, in regards to the decolonization of institutions and international cooperation.
So here's some ideas of what it might look like. Imagine if communities and regions could set their own priorities and that donors compete to be their preferred partner. Imagine if funders could find creative ways to get funding and decision-making to the lowest possible unit of organization, the family or the community-based organization. Imagine if bilateral donors relinquished their power, and in return, what they get is more equitable partnerships with communities, organizations, and other countries. And finally, I think what we're aiming for is a values-based approach to international cooperation. When we held a consultation, a global consultation, we asked what values matter most to global South or majority world actors to build actual equitable partnerships, and they came up with 4 values. And what's striking is those 4 values came up in the first Mentimeter findings. The values were trust, respect, humility, and mutuality. They said if we can reset ourselves, and that's about mindsets and worldviews, if we can think about those 4 values, then actually we'll have a radically different approach to international cooperation. So I'd encourage you to think about your work within those 4 frames, those 4 values. Thank you.
John Lennon would be thrilled, I think. Thank you very much for this answer. Thank you very much for this panel. And I see you later. We will now finish this event with thank you. Thank you so much. So you just go on with applause, please. Just a little bit. Ich würde nun gern.
And now I would like to hand over to Birgit Pickel.
She's the BMZ's Director General for Africa, and I would like to discuss key takeaways for the BMZ with her. Could you join me on the stage? She will also be talking about ways in which these points could be taken up in the BMZ's future work. So, Birgit Pickel. Well, thank you very much for the many great thoughts and ideas which you shared with us. I think one very important message of the BMZ through this event, as was pointed out by Ms. Kofler and the Minister, is that we want to look at this and we want to listen, because that is what came out of this debate. It's a very complex topic, and I want to thank you very much for the repeated statement that it is courageous for the German government to look at these things. We're very happy to hear that. And as the moderator said at the beginning, we don't want to have a top-down discussion. We want to have a discussion with people who have been working in this field for a long time. There are 3 things I would like to do. First, I would like to name what are important building blocks from our point of view. Then maybe look at scope for action that is available, and what are the building blocks which we think, well, listen closely, look closely, voice interests clearly. This has been pointed out very clearly in the discussion and remains very important. This is very important, and we have formats for that, government negotiations and others, and we will have to take a closer look at them. Second point, we need to move away from this donor-recipient mindset in our actions, which is not easy because there are structural asymmetries which continue to exist, but a lot starts from our mindsets. And working for equitable partnerships that empower both sides should be our goal. We are open for continuing this conversation and learning. And this doubtlessly includes that both cooperation partners jointly define objectives, but also define the knowledge through which we work, etc. But it also means both sides taking on responsibility for the goals they have jointly defined. For instance, we have partnerships on joint energy transition processes with South Africa, with Senegal, and then both sides have to work towards that. The third point is sincerity and honesty, as I said earlier, about the different preconditions from which we start. I'm talking about money. You can't exclude that from the equation. It's part of the situation and political weight, as Martin Kimani and others pointed out. These are asymmetries, and we have to recognize them and jointly address them and see how greater accountability can be created. Regarding scope for action, well, you raised very many points. Also from our own exchange with civil society, which we had at the BMZ in October, and we learned that we have to start in our own institution. Create awareness within our own institution. This is something we can do. This is scope for action which we have, and we take this seriously. It has been pointed out several times how we're doing this, the 5 priorities of this process, which Bärbel Kofler outlined, so I'm not going to repeat that now. Further aspects, well, development cooperation, or maybe we will call it international cooperation in the future. These may be terms that we might change and look at. But our understanding of development or international cooperation is that it should take partners' national priorities and, I mean, all levels, communities, government level. We have many partners, but take their priorities as a starting point. And then look at what we have to offer as the BMZ, because we also stand for interests and for values, and we cannot fully abandon that. And having an open joint discussion of that and aligning that will then, I think, enable us to bring about real impact. And the offer we can make and the instruments we can offer, we can, of course, advance and reform at the BMZ. Let me talk about the what and the how. We can work even more with local and regional initiatives and support them. You said, use what you have. Martin Kimani, you quoted that at one point. I think that's a good example. On the African continent, there are initiatives such as the Africa Climate Summit and next year the Africa Energy Summit. This is something that we want to take guidance from. We're advocating for more voting rights for countries in international financial institutions. As the minister pointed out, this is something that takes a lot of perseverance, but working towards that goal, I think, is important. In intergovernmental cooperation too, the AU is now part of the G20, which is a very good thing, but a lot remains to be done on that front. There are tools such as South-South cooperation and triangular cooperation, which we are already supporting, but which may have scope for expansion because they are based, they open up a new understanding of cooperation. And finally, and this can't be said often enough, make local and pre-colonial knowledge systematically a basis for our planning and our activities. This is a standard by which we should abide in our cooperation. And yet, as we talk about international cooperation, what also remains important is that we're talking about exchange. We too, of course, have certain things that matter to us. And maybe it's an exciting endeavor to align that. Generally, we want to look at instances of good practices and transform practices that are not good. And as has been said several times, this is just the starting point for a process which will remain important beyond new terms of government. You all know that Germany is headed for new elections, but I think this is a topic which plays a big role for us here at the BMZ. We have a very active staff. We have a working group. I know that KfW and JZ also have groups too. A lot has been said about the young generation. Well, this topic is on the table and we are being pushed to deal with the topic. And I think this gives us a good chance to firmly embed this within our institution. And also diversity in terms of recruitment policies has already been mentioned. I think this too is an important pillar in this debate. Looking ahead, we have listened to critical voices and we will continue to do so. And I am convinced that development policy, development cooperation, if I use these terms after all, and we talked about development ministries, I think Germany is now the only country that actually has a separate development ministry. I would like to point this out. And our mission and the question of how do we achieve the SDGs, how do we achieve a more equitable international order is something that we are pursuing and bringing to the cabinet table, or making headway on the Supply Chain Act. We consider this an opportunity. So as the BMZ and as development policymakers, we consider ourselves as part of the solution and not part of the problem. We want to continue this endeavor, and let me conclude by raising one point which was also raised by Ambassador Kimani. We're living in times in which it's not always easy to openly and actively discuss this topic. There are many very critical voices. We're getting a lot of press inquiries and parliamentary inquiries that question this approach. And we have to deal with this in a very constructive way in order to retain the basis for addressing this important topic together with all the stakeholders here in this room and online, and continue along this path, because ultimately this is about working toward a more equitable international order, and that's what the BMZ wants to work for. Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Ms. Pickel. I always ask one question that hasn't been given to you in advance. So what is the first thing you will do when you return to your desk tomorrow morning? Please use the microphone. Well, my desk tomorrow will be in a train, in a Deutsche Bahn train, which has the great advantage that you have some time to do some work, and sometimes even for longer than you think, because the train takes longer than expected. But I have written down a lot in today's discussion with the wonderful input, starting with the reading from the book, Africa is Not a Country, all the way to inputs from the audience and the panelists. And I want to compare the notes with what is the current status here at the BMZ and what will be our next steps. Well, great. Maybe we'll meet each other on the train tomorrow. Thank you very much. So please give a round of applause to Birgit Pickel. Now I would like to thank you for your patience. We have this small delay, so we did an extra 13 minutes. I had been promising not to do that, but we did after all, because we did need some time, and I have, on purpose, I didn't always press you to hurry up. I want to thank everybody very much. Tipo Faluyin.
Dann bei unseren Keynote-SpeakerInnen.
Our keynote speakers and the panelists, a big round of applause for them, please. And, of course, looking at the organizing team and facilitators, I want to thank you all for your attention, for your active participation, including from the live stream. This is very important for us. This is the only way by which we can tell whether this event is making a difference. So give yourselves a round of applause. And I really have to say this. I would like to thank the organizing team at BMZ who have been acting tirelessly in the background for weeks and months to get this event prepared all the way to the last minute. A lot emerged through rethinking and being inclusive. I was involved in this process at quite an early point, and I want to thank you very much. And I want to thank MediaPool. We couldn't have done this without all the technology experts, so thank you very much. This really brings us to the very end. I would like to invite you to look at the event Learning from the Past for the Future, organized by Farafina Africa House Berlin, an exhibit. Umar Diallo has been running Africa House in Berlin for 30 years and is the founder of that institution. Maybe he's here, I'm not sure. Over there, he's here, great. Is he? Yeah. So give him a round of applause. He shared the exhibition with BMZ on the occasion of the conference, and he's headed the Africa House for 30 years, and at least for as long. He's been campaigning as a sociologist who was born in Guinea. He's been campaigning for greater awareness of German colonial history. Let me quote from his statement. Without a proper understanding of history, the current challenges of colonialism, migration, displacement, and war cannot be overcome. Only together can we make our planet livable for all its people. The exhibition and the Africa House aim to constantly reaffirm this aspiration. In 2024, Umar Diallo was awarded the honorary award of the German Africa Foundation. And in addition to his exhibition, the Federal Foreign Office has provided us with parts of the infamous General Act adopted at the conference, as you heard at the beginning. So you can view this too. And you can also scan a QR code to look at the entire General Act in a digital version. So I wish you good discussions, a good get-together during the reception, and thank you very much for your attention.